And again, the young guy found himself here, and his very stay made him feel so sad. Once again, an island drowning in smoke appeared before his eyes. The ruins of Western-style buildings seemed to be flying around, indicating that the place was deserted. But suddenly, while the place was covered in deathly silence, in the distance the guy saw two bright lights that looked like someone's evil eyes. At that moment, the smoke began to clear, and an unknown silhouette became clearly visible in the distance. Taking a closer look, the boy saw a large, strong man with a bare torso who, looking straight into the boy's eyes, asked him to come closer. And without waiting for the guy to approach, the man seemed to fly up to him and very clearly stated that he would wait for him on the edge of hell. These words seemed to send shivers down the boy's body, who couldn't believe that this could happen. And before he could understand anything, the young man suddenly woke up in his bed. Having come to his senses, the guy finally realized that it was this strange dream again. "Sora, we're late!" They shouted from the other room, and the young man, turning over, shouted that he was already coming, although in fact he didn't want to get up at all. He kept thinking about the dream and the man he seemed to know. But the question remained about what kind of hell the stranger was talking about. While doing his morning routine and looking at himself in the mirror, the guy wondered if he had overdone it with his studies, that he was having such unusual dreams. The young man was so carried away by his thoughts that he didn't even notice his father coming out of the shower. "Hey, Sora, did you oversleep today?" the man asked cheerfully, patting his son on the head. But the boy didn't like it, because he no longer considered himself a child at 15 years old. Sora's father didn't even take the boy's words into account and simply laughed, suggesting that he take a look at his muscles. But the boy continued doing his morning routine, and without looking at the man said that if they weren't huddled in a tiny apartment, he wouldn't have to see his naked father every day, to which the man promised that as soon as he gets rich, he'll buy a big house. The man even reminded that then the guy and Ricky would have their own rooms, but Sora had been hearing about this for 5 years already and didn't really believe that it would ever happen. As he washed his face, the boy thought about how much easier life had become once Ricky had joined the army. But his brother had been there for 3 years already. Sora himself also planned to join the army. But then the guy would have to say goodbye to the wildlife he had every day. The young man would not be able to bear seeing his slightly unreliable father, who jokes a lot. And I also had to say goodbye to my strict but very loving mother. Still, Sora was happy to live with such a family, wishing that these days would never end. However, the guy always knew that peaceful life would end sooner or later. And then, on one of the calmest days, the earth began to shake, and something happened that Sora did not expect at all. In the middle of the city, out of nowhere, a huge tower rose up. It was just a shock for the guy, because it's not often that you see such unusual things. At that time, Sora had no idea how much the appearance of this tower would change the course of human history. Military fighters immediately appeared in the sky, heading towards the tower. But the guy understood one thing very clearly. The tower was definitely connected somehow with his disturbing dreams. As soon as the tower appeared, the boy's brother immediately called his family and said that everything was fine and that he just needed to follow the orders of the self-defense forces, and then he would be able to return home. Ricky promised his parents and brother that he would definitely return home, but it was clearly audible that his voice was weak. After that evening, they lost contact with him, which left the whole family in despair and not knowing what to do next. The news said that people were not in danger and should stay at home. But this lasted until the news first became more and more alarming, where they said that there were already 20 towers, and then the broadcasting stopped altogether. The same information began to be transmitted on the radio. And then the order came to evacuate and people in the country began to flee. Father immediately began to get ready, and Mother left a letter on the bed for her brother, saying that they had gone to shelter. And the family headed to a safe place, packing only the bare necessities into large backpacks. Sora kept looking around as he walked, and everything he saw seemed to hint at something. A lot of military equipment passed by him, and looking inside, Sora saw how hopelessness was written on the faces of the soldiers passing by. Their cars were marked with horrible claw marks, and from inside came a nauseating smell of decay. The boy's father also saw everything that was happening and wondered what was going on, worrying about his eldest son who was never able to return home. A gym located near the family's home became a temporary evacuation shelter. The shelter was full of refugees who had pitched their tents and sleeping mats right on the floor. But Sora noticed that in such a large room it was quite quiet. People did not say anything, and it was as if everyone was waiting for their death. But even in such silence, there were troublemakers. They tried in every possible way to make their presence known. One of them was a tall, daring guy who stole bread even from the little ones. Seeing a little boy sitting on the floor about to open a package of food, the guy grabbed him by the hand, shouting that the boy was stealing his bread. To divert suspicion from himself, the guy shouted that everyone got a loaf, and the boy had supposedly already eaten his. Seeing that they didn't want to give him food, the guy hit the boy in the stomach with all his might, causing the pack of bread to fall to the floor. The people sitting nearby noticed this situation, but no one intervened and simply gasped. Everyone immediately turned away. This was only to the boy's advantage. And, glad that he was in a winning situation, he grabbed the boy's hand even more tightly and began to tug at it. Leaning towards the frightened boy, the guy slyly asked if he would mind if he took the bread, and the boy had no choice but to agree, just so that they would leave him alone. Realizing that the bread was now his, the ill-wisher laughed slyly, looking at the defenseless child. And before leaving, the guy mockingly told the boy not to whine because it wouldn't last long anyway. But suddenly, Sora's father appeared behind him and very confidently and menacingly asked why they were doing this, since they were all not in the best situation. The guy didn't even blink an eye and, turning to the man, told him to worry about himself, calling him an old man. The boy's father could not stand this attitude and raised his tone, shouting at the impudent man to return the bread. The guy was clearly not afraid of anything and did not even listen to the man, but simply swung his arm to hit him. Sora's father reacted quickly, stopping the blow coming towards him and giving the bully a final, harder hit. The guy immediately fell to the floor, and from the force of the blow to his face, he couldn't even get up. The man, having made sure that he had dealt with the offender, was finally able to return the bread to the defenseless boy. And finally, Sora's father looked menacingly at the boy, who continued to lie on the floor. The impudent fellow, not wanting to be hit again, simply kept silent. Not wanting to deal with this, the guy slowly stood up and, spitting at the man's feet, walked away. Sora quickly ran up to his father, expressing his excitement. The man, noticing his son's agitation, immediately calmed him down, saying that he would keep an eye on the impudent boy so that he would not bother anyone else. But Sora, seeing who exactly was bullying the boy, realized that he would never forget this guy even after death. It was Eiji Kagawa who made Sora unable to even move. This bastard who took pleasure in torturing the guy in the most cruel ways. And from then on, his life turned into horror, and being at school became simply unbearable. Sora didn't have time to indulge in his memories before a soldier suddenly ran into the shelter building, declaring an urgent notification. The soldier shouted anxiously that everyone should immediately leave the evacuation shelter through the back door and get into one of the trucks, and began directing everyone towards the exit. But the residents stood there questioningly and began to ask why they needed to leave. But the man in uniform said that this was confidential information and he could not say the reason. A man who looked like an important person came out from among the crowd and began to show his displeasure. The man in the suit started shouting that they were first kept locked up in their homes for 2 days and then evacuated here. But he couldn't say anything, and shouting to the soldier why he pays taxes then, he threw his bag on the floor, frightening everyone around. Suddenly, everyone heard strange sounds coming from outside. Now the soldier began to shout in panic, ordering everyone to run, saying that they were already here. Sora immediately asked his mom and dad to go right away, afraid that something terrible might happen. And looking at the place where the sounds were coming from, the guy definitely had a bad feeling. Hearing the noise, the soldier quickly ran up and began to hold the doors, shouting that he would try to hold them back while the others got into the truck. But the door could not be held for long. It was quickly knocked down and creatures similar to people, but with horns, appeared from there. The first to run into the room was a creature with huge fangs, menacing eyes and a scar across half its face, which clearly wanted to kill everyone. Sora looked at the attackers and only froze, not understanding what the hell was going on here. People scattered with screams just to avoid falling into the hands of the monsters. Sora's parents ran ahead and tried in every way to shout at their son to run faster. Meanwhile, the frightened people ran as fast as they could and climbed into the trucks that were already ready to leave. Sora couldn't make it in time, and seeing that there was little space left in the trucks, he shouted to his parents to get into the car first. Having made sure that his parents had climbed in, the boy began to climb in himself. Seeing that it was difficult for him to climb up, the boy's father quickly extended his hand to him and began to help. But the people who were already inside, out of fear that the monsters would catch up with them, started shouting that there were no more seats and that the guy should get lost. Sora realized that there was no point in fighting over a place in the car and that he needed to come up with something. Removing his hand, the boy ran to another truck, shouting to his mother and father so that they wouldn't lose him. There were no seats in the car next to mine either, and everyone was rushing to close the doors. Then the guy decided to just run until he saw a free truck, and after a couple of seconds, Sora was finally able to climb inside, thinking that the danger had passed. The people were in such a hurry that they even pushed others in front of them, which is why Sora couldn't climb up right away. But suddenly a helping hand appeared before his eyes, The happy guy immediately began to thank for the help and quickly climbed into the truck. But the guy's smile immediately disappeared when he saw who exactly helped him. Sora couldn't even move from fear, realizing that he would not be safe anywhere. Before his eyes stood Eiji Kagawa, who was smiling a big sly smile and looking at the boy with greedy eyes. Eiji, still holding the boy's hand, shouted for him to die instead of his father and pushed him out of the truck. Sora thought that this was the end and fell to the ground and couldn't even get up because of the people running too fast. Everyone ran past him, and no one even wanted to help the defenseless guy. Still lying on the ground, Sora grabbed his head to protect himself from an accidental blow and began to think that it was too early for him to die. Hoping that someone would help him, the young man closed his eyes, unable even to rise. And opening one eye, Sora saw in the middle of the crowd someone's legs, which looked more like the legs of a ghost. Raising his head, the guy saw the same man who came to him in his dream. But this time the stranger was like a ghost, and the people running past him did not notice him. The man stared at the lying guy and seemed to say in his head that he would be waiting for him on the edge of hell. Suddenly, everything around changed. Fully opening his eyes, Sora, continuing to press himself to the ground, realized that the asphalt had suddenly changed to dusty sand, and the screams of people died down. The guy began to think that this was a dream, and, afraid to get to his feet, he began to look around. While Sora was trying to figure out what was going on, he heard something flying towards him out of the corner of his ear. And when he looked, he saw a large stone hammer tied with a rope. A large axe struck right next to the guy's face, quickly stunning him. Turning around, Sora saw a green goblin who clearly wanted to kill the boy. The boy immediately started running, not understanding where his mother and father were and why he was here alone. The goblin, deciding not to run after the guy, simply threw his stone axe after him. The weapon flew just inches from Sora, leaving him with a small cut. The hammer hit the ground with all its force and lost a small piece of stone. Having picked up the weapon, the goblin continued to run after the guy, who kept wondering why the monster was running after him. The goblin continued to speed up, giving off a ferocious smile. Sora, seeing that the monster had abandoned its hammer and was continuing to move towards him, was left wondering what was going on. The guy's life began to change in a matter of seconds when a huge tower appeared in the city, emerging from nowhere. Then that bastard showed up and threw the young man out of the truck. And then there was this strange old man who first appeared in a dream, and then in real life. And now a fierce goblin is running after him, wanting to kill him for some reason. Sora, realizing that he wouldn't be able to run for long, decided to act differently. Grabbing a shard of the hammer, the guy turned around sharply and pounced on the monster, starting to mercilessly beat the goblin in all places on his body. Eventually, Sora cut down his killer and simply sat down in front of the lifeless body, realizing that he had survived and committed his first kill. After examining the stranger, the young man noticed that he looked like a character from the game and also saw the number on his chest. But what started to happen next made the guy crawl back in great fear. An unknown black object, similar to a crystal, began to crawl out of the open wound on the goblin's chest. The guy's face showed wild surprise at what he saw. The goblin's wound began to turn blue as a strange object flew out of it, rising into the air. The black crystal rose higher and higher until it was level with Sora's face, and unexpectedly for him, the object flew with great force straight into his chest, causing Sora to even curl up in place. An unknown object entered it, but left no traces. And then the wounds on the guy's body began to heal on their own, confusing him even more. Sora began to feel much stronger, and having pulled the hammer out of the dead goblin, the guy concluded that for defeating enemies, his level increases, just like in the game. Leaving the corpse on the ground, Sora walked on, thinking that there were definitely others on this tiny island, so he should look around to avoid being attacked again. Having set off on his journey, the guy saw only desert and abandoned ruins of houses. Sora went all the way around, but there were still no monsters or other roads. But suddenly, the guy came across a strange road leading through the ruined arch of an old stone building. There was only one exit from this arch, from which an unsafe staircase led downwards. Approaching the very edge of the island, Sora carefully glanced at the stairs, the steps of which seemed to float in the air. The steps were not attached to anything and remained levitating in the air, encircling the island drowning in clouds. This design looked very dubious and suspicious to the guy, but realizing that there was no other way out, Sora began to carefully take steps, holding the hammer tightly in his hand, expecting some kind of trick. In the games, such an area is the territory of the main monster, and the guy could simply respawn if he fell. There was no time to check whether this world was like a game or not, and the guy still decided to be careful. As Sora thought, the stairs eventually ended near an unknown entrance to a stone building. Showing the same caution, the guy looked inside, expecting danger every time. Moving further down the tunnel, Sora headed towards the light at the very end. Entering another room, the young man saw a large torch burning with a bright fire. The torch stood on a pedestal on which stood the slab, and behind which were large closed gates. On the slab itself, and as he came closer, Sora saw letters that he had never seen before, but the letters formed words that the boy's brain somehow understood. The words said that the fragments belonged to their bearers, and by collecting everything, one could gain the right to leave the abyss. It became clear that Sora had fallen into the abyss and needed to collect all the fragments to get out of it. Now the guy was motivated, knowing that there was a way out of here. If you think about it, that monster wasn't that strong and the young man had every chance of getting out of here alive. And full of confidence, the guy opened the doors leading into the unknown. It was unknown how much strength would be needed to pass through all the islands, but Sora was ready for anything after today. The first tier of the poor was a territory with an area of 900 square meters, and the number that was engraved on the body of that monster was the Roman one. The second tier occupied 1,800 square meters, and the monster had the number 2 on it. The third one was 3,600, and on one of the monsters the number 3 was visible. The fragments were only in the bodies of monsters with numbers. They were the key to passing to the next level, and the higher the number, the stronger the monster. But what worried the boy most was that these keys were becoming more and more difficult to find. The area of the tiers doubled each time, as did the number of monsters around. Sora had already gotten tired by this time, but he continued to move in order to get out, in the hope that he would be able to return to his city and see his parents. However, his strength was quickly restored. Since the stronger the monster was, the stronger he became. As we moved through the tiers, we encountered increasingly more diverse monsters. Meanwhile, the unknown man who came to the guy in his dream was waiting for him on a high mountain. On the 12th floor, Sora encountered the monsters that attacked the shelter that day. But now they were no match for him, and the guy dealt with the evil spirits quite quickly. During the time he spent in this world, Sora's hair began to grow, gradually changing color to white, and the number of monsters became so great that his senses began to dull. Their numbers began to grow to over 1 million. And when Sora reached the 30th level, the number of monsters reached 500 million. Finding a key has become like finding a needle in a haystack. Some of the key-carrying monsters were guarded by groups of other monsters, and others hid in tiny caves. But what irritated the guy most was the amount of time it took to kill them. However, Sora continued to walk forward and forward. He had only one goal: to get out of here. And for this, the guy literally walked over the heads of these bloodthirsty monsters, mercilessly killing each key carrier, continuing to move forward. Over all the battles, Sora became stronger. His body acquired a more muscular appearance, and his hair seemed to grow longer with each battle. Each type of monster was completely different. Some walked mercilessly on the ground, making terrible sounds, and some flew in the sky, spreading their large wings. Such a number of undead became a bit difficult for the guy, as if he was already going crazy from the monotony of his actions. Everything around hardly changed its appearance, and the guy's head began to boil from the same area. On the 42nd tier, he wondered what year it was, and quickly cut off his own question, since the concept of time was no longer important. There was only death and carnage left here, and in order to somehow understand the passage of time, Sora found a huge slab. On this slab, he began to scratch sticks as if counting down the days. Although, in essence, time and its course were not important. The monsters at this time were already waiting to attack him and were slowly walking towards him. Suddenly, while the guy was thinking about his stay here, someone very big stood behind him. It was a huge monster with a boar's head and a big belly, and as soon as he saw the young man, he immediately swung his hammer, and he struck towards the boy without even thinking about how strong his opponent was. Sora quickly dodged the blow and jumped back towards the beast, ripping open its belly. And then the guy dealt with the subsequent monsters. Having torn off the head of another undead, Sora caught his breath. The guy remembered how many monsters there were in the end. When he recovered, the first thing he did was return to the stove, and again he began to carve a new notch on it. Looking at the number of scratched sticks, Sora thought that it was time to find the key, and the question remained how many more levels he would have to go through to finally find the coveted key. Suddenly, the stone slab with the number of monsters collapsed right before the guy's eyes, leaving only stone ruins. Another monster of enormous size, similar to some kind of insect, appeared in front of Sora. This appearance really impressed the guy, and he even thought that he had finally found the key to move to the next level. Full of enthusiasm, the guy prepared to jump on the beast to make another kill. But the monster seemed strong, and it was worth releasing all your strength to defeat it. However, when Sora started fighting him, he realized that no matter how strong the monster was, it was all the same. After all, even monsters who thought they were strong died with one blow, and each fight seemed to become easier and easier. Having killed another beast, the guy began to realize one thing that was not very pleasant. As it turned out, for him any power lost its meaning. But he never found the key to the 42nd tier, which made the situation even more complicated. Sora stopped feeling anything during the murders, and with each death his mind seemed to break more and more. And eventually the guy couldn't take it anymore and started screaming for the key to appear. Laughing hysterically, he continued to scream, fight, and look for the treasured key, but all was in vain. In the 20th century, 20 towers suddenly appeared all over the world. All the people were then horrified by what was happening around them and decided to destroy the towers. Before humanity had time to deal with them, monsters began to emerge from there, practically destroying the human race. Most were killed and many victims remained. And that day became known as the Day of Judgment. The few survivors awakened and gained access to the mysterious system. And those who awakened were granted colossal power, and human society was rebuilt. And the awakened founded hunters' guilds, after which everyone began to live with everything differently, while Sora at this time went through tier after tier in search of the key. And so, once again running after the monster with the supposed key, Sora saw something unusual. The dog-like beast, who wanted to run away from the boy so badly, was chained in unusual chains that glowed with a bright light. As if human speech was heard above the beast itself, it was clearly heard as someone said that she had used an advanced teleportation scroll and that the teleportation needed to be interrupted. After these words, the monster, without realizing it, began to rise into the sky, striving towards an unknown source of light, which resembled an exit. Sora seemed to come to his senses, seeing a semblance of a way out of this chaos, having forgotten about the keys. All this time, it seemed to him that there was no way out, and this would go on forever. But now it became clear that there was every chance to get out of here. And gathering all his strength together, the guy jumped straight towards the glowing whirlwind and rushed upward. But as soon as he was almost close to the portal, a notification appeared, which said that the summoning from the abyss could not move more than 2 living creatures. The guy, who had been in this place for so long, couldn't afford to miss such a chance. And becoming embittered, Sora began to look for the one who was preventing him from getting through the portal. Raising his head up, the young man seemed to fly towards the large circle, ignoring the notifications and chains that were trying to hold him back. At the same time, not far from the city, the earth was in a quiet, gloomy state. The sky was plunged into darkness, and almost nothing remained of the beautiful nature of the earth. A girl with pink hair was running away from someone in panic. Feeling the danger, she ran very quickly through the grass, not paying attention to anything. Level 19. Yu Sonozaki wanted to get away from the chase without looking back. But suddenly, her foot caught on the root of an unknown plant, and the girl fell to the ground, losing control of the situation. Unable to stand up, Sonozaki began to realize that things were bad and there was little chance of escape left. The root that the girl tripped over belonged to Aika, a level 30 druid who could control plants. Next to her stood a man with a large sword, who, coming closer, began to demand the return of the teleportation scroll, saying that a level 60th scroll was not something that a level 19 beginner could possess. Choji Shido, realizing that the girl was not going to get up, threatened her to give the scroll, promising to kill her otherwise. Sonozaki looked at Shido in horror and began to scream that fighting between hunters was prohibited and the guy was definitely breaking the rules. Shosei Toshida, level 38, who was a barbarian with a large sword, treated the rules with disregard, believing them to be unnecessary. And thrusting his sword into the ground right in front of the girl's face, he declared that he was the one making the rules here. Without letting Sonozaki leave, he once again asked her nicely to give him the scroll, promising to spare her hands in that case. The girl, realizing that she had no choice, began to stall for time, holding the scroll behind her back, declaring that if she were in their place, she would not have driven herself into a corner. Aika, who was standing nearby, immediately realized that the girl wanted to use forced summoning and immediately ordered Sonozaki to be stopped so that she could not escape. Toshida immediately became furious at such impudence and was about to attack. Grabbing the sword tighter, he shouted for the fugitive to give up the scroll. But Sonozaki herself was not going to give up just like that, having already come up with an escape plan. The guy's sword stopped instantly when he saw the girl's actions. Realizing that she was opening a teleportation circle, Toshida began to panic, knowing that there was little time left. Sonozaki decided that if she was going to die now, she'd better take the others with her. Aika, standing behind Toshida, realized that no one would be able to control the advanced monster that was brought in this way, which meant that it would be the end for them all. Shouting that she had to be stopped, all three rushed into battle. Shouting for everyone to die, Sonozaki prepared to take all of her enemies with her. And opening the portal, a powerful lightning bolt struck from it, from which Sora's silhouette fell out. Eika and Toshida immediately felt the overwhelming force, realizing that things would be tough. Without noticing the guy, everyone's gaze turned to the powerful beam from which the monster was about to appear. A formidable beast descended to the ground, releasing all its power. The third level, Cerberus straightened up and looked around in search of living creatures. But when the beast came closer, all three saw a small dog and began to laugh that so much noise was made for the sake of such a small beast. Aika began to laugh at Sonozaki, who did not understand why such a weak monster came to her. But suddenly someone's hand pierced the animal, frightening the girl. It was Sora who cut the animal in half with one blow. The entire team that was chasing Sonozaki froze in horror, not understanding what kind of humanoid monster it was. Sonozaki fell to the ground in fear, afraid to even move. Sora, with scars all over his body, finally realized that he had made it to the human world. And from an excess of emotions, the guy screamed hysterically, wanting everyone to know that he finally got out of there. No one tried to move, afraid to make an unnecessary movement and disturb the unknown. The guy's laughter alone made everyone standing nearby tremble, and his strength put extreme pressure on everything around him. No one could understand who it was and why this man came here from another world. When Sora finally came to his senses and realized the situation, he looked at everyone around him. First of all, the guy approached Aika, frightening her with just one look. The young man's eyes radiated incredible rage, and through the hair that had fallen over his face, a certain smile was visible. Leaning towards the girl, the guy asked if they were on Earth. And having received a positive answer, Sora laughed even harder, happy that he had finally returned. Looking at the men, the guy at first didn't even understand why the people were dressed so strangely, thinking that they were some kind of cosplayers. Considering this to be impudence, Toshida was the first to point his sword at the stranger, declaring that the Tiger Roar Guild should not be underestimated. And with a quick movement, the man rushed towards the guy, but Sora quickly repelled the attack. And he looked at everyone around him again, but with crazier eyes. Toshida stepped back and only whispered that the guy was a monster and nothing else. From these words, the guy's anger began to increase and everything he saw seemed to double. And then it began to seem to him that the man who stood opposite him was the goblin he had killed on the tiers. And unable to control his anger, the boy rushed towards Toshido, grabbing him by the throat. Sora began to think that it was another monster, and so began to demand the man to show his number. But Toshida himself did not understand what was being discussed, and could barely say it. Looking at him again, Sora thought about his next steps, and yet the guy decided to let go of the one who dared to insult him. Toshida collapsed to the ground, still feeling the colossal strength of this man. The man was so scared that he even wet his pants and started crawling backwards, wanting to save his life. Sora began to realize that during his time in the abyss, his mind had become seriously shaken, and in order not to do anything else, the guy told the gang to get lost. The Tiger Roar Guild rushed in panic and ran with all their might away from danger. Sonozaki, continuing to stand and not move, managed to examine these terrible scars on the guy's body, feeling the powerful force emanating from him. The girl could not understand who he was, and it was unlikely that he was a monster summoned from the abyss by a scroll. Sora, after watching the fugitives, turned to the frightened girl and asked how many years had passed since the appearance of the rabies. Sonozaki stuttered a little and replied that exactly 5 years had passed. The guy still asked again if they were really on Earth, why everyone was dressed so strangely, and what scroll they were talking about. And then Sonozaki said that after the towers appeared 5 years ago, a third of the city fell, and the people developed a system. The girl also said that the city, C, was subjected to major invasions, and she managed to escape from there. Hearing the name of the city, Sora remembered that this was his hometown, where he lost his parents that day. In a panic, the guy began to interrogate the girl, trying to find out what state the city was in now, and, as it turned out, it was already practically destroyed. But strong people were sent there who should be able to kill the monsters. Remembering that day, Sora began to find out how to get to City C. Sonozaki only had time to point with her hand in which direction to go when the guy immediately disappeared, running in that direction. The girl did not expect that he would go there alone, knowing that the city was teeming with scary and powerful monsters. Seeing how mysterious this man was, the girl decided to immediately go to her sister and tell her what had happened. Meanwhile, the Tiger Roar Guild slowly walked towards the abandoned city, helping Toshida walk. All four were very frightened and silently tried to comprehend the horror they had to face. Suddenly, in the middle of an empty street, an unknown man dressed in a black cloak appeared in front of them. Looking at the four, the stranger said that he felt someone's presence, and coming closer to the guild, he said that he was giving them 2 seconds to tell where the guy was. All four looked questioningly at the mysterious stranger. Toshida yelled at the man in the cloak, asking him if he was kidding, not even thinking about answering his question. The stranger, after hearing the man's screams, said that time was up and quickly rushed towards everyone, killing Aika, Shido, and Toshida, sparing no one. Meanwhile, the Tiger Roar Guild headquarters was located nearby in one of the safe places. The young girl reported that contact with Mr. Toshida's group had been lost, and the location of Sonozaki and the scroll was unknown. The guy sitting in front of her, calmly holding a glass of red wine, declared that this was nonsense. One of the main guilds did not believe that the guys recommended by the girl did not defeat a level 19 summoner. Rich Mukai, level 118, who was a priest, saw that the signal from everyone stopped coming at the same time, which meant that they were killed in one blow, which was almost impossible. Having ordered to find out who did it, Mukai calmly let his assistant go. And finally, the guy told the girl to catch Sonozaki and let her tell everything. Approaching the window, Mukai thought, deciding to kill anyone who dared to raise a hand against his people. Suddenly, to his great surprise, Sora flew past his panoramic window, not even paying attention to him. Mukai smelled the disgusting smell of blood through the window and even winced, wondering who it was. But then the guy saw that the stranger was running towards the fallen zone. And for a second, he remembered an invasion of a completely different level, in which major forces undoubtedly intervened, and the tower, which had been asleep for 5 years, finally began to move. Lost in his memories, Mukai quickly ordered all search parties to be recalled. After all, there was a matter that required more urgent intervention. Meanwhile, Sora ran as fast as he could towards his city, wanting to find out all the details of the past 5 years. The fallen area of City C looked very abandoned and destroyed. Even the sky above this area began to darken, and some demonic birds were flying around making different sounds. During the 5 years that the guy spent in the Abyss, this place turned into hell. But in the Abyss, while Sora was there, he went through many trials. The guy remembered that as soon as he found himself on the first tier, his strength was too small. But now he had become incredibly strong, which gave him a great advantage in surviving in this world. The boy's feelings had become hardened after all those numerous murders, and it seemed that he himself had become a monster during these 5 years. But thoughts about his family forced him to move forward and look for a way out. The monsters he once feared now seemed like tiny flies to him. But now, remembering his mother, father, and brother, Sora only hoped that they were able to protect themselves and stay alive. City C used to be bustling with life, but now it was just a wasteland where there wasn't a single living soul. All the buildings are destroyed, as if after a strong earthquake, and yet there are no traces of the monsters killing anyone. It was as if no one had lived here since the evacuation was announced. Sora, having reached his house, carefully opened the door to the apartment where he lived. But over time, the door simply broke. Looking inside, all that was visible was an empty apartment, shabby with time. The guy knew he wouldn't meet anyone, but he still came here. Lost in his memories, Sora looked at the destroyed apartment, into which the wind blew through the broken window. Looking around, he noticed a piece of paper lying on the dining table. Taking it, the guy saw a letter in which the following was written. "Dear Sora, everyone says you died, but your mother and I refuse to believe it. We took your things and laid them out in your room as they were before. We believe that you will return." After reading this, the boy began to cry, realizing how his parents risked their lives to come here for him. The letter said that his mother hung his favorite clothes from small to large sizes in his closet, so that the boy could always wear something new whenever he came home. The parents also made sure that their son found them and therefore left a map of the road to shelter number 6 in the dresser and wrote that as soon as Sora read this letter, he would immediately find his parents. And after reading his father's words in the letter, which said that he and his mother were always waiting for him, the boy took the family photo attached to the letter, where all 4 were captured in one shot. Putting the photo to his chest, the guy began to cry even harder, hoping that they were all still alive and that he would be able to find them. Dressed in his favorite clothes, Sora picked up his knife and looked at himself through his reflection, seeing how he had changed. Thinking about how strong he was now, the guy decided to first tidy himself up and casually, using a knife, he cut off some of the hair that had grown during the time in the Abyss. Sora believed that he would be able to get back the lost days, no matter what it took. And the first thing he needed to do was find shelter number 6. The young man decided to move east as shown on the map, straight to shelter number 6. But the road passed through ruins strewn with debris and blood. Sora then decided to make his own way to get there faster. And having thought everything through, the guy ran to the shelter, running and jumping over the ruins of the debris. But on his way, he suddenly encountered a monster that looked like an eagle with large feathered wings. This was not a big difficulty for Sora, and the boy dealt with the animal quite quickly. So on his way, he met many monsters, which the young man immediately killed for his goal. One of the guards of the Fallen Zone, standing on top of the building, at that moment heard strange sounds, not even guessing who was making these sounds, but the second guard only joked that he was just imagining it. But suddenly, unexpectedly, someone flew very quickly right over their heads without even letting them understand who it was. Two young guys turned their gaze towards the flying thing, trying to see what it was. Later, another guy came up to their building with a phone in his hands, shouting that he had managed to film the object. And to everyone's surprise, after watching the video, it turned out that it was a person, or rather, Sora, flying at high speed towards his parents. Flying past tall buildings, the guy noticed a screaming girl who asked him not to approach her. Three guys slowly walked step by step towards the innocent girl and threw her compliments, saying how pretty she was and how long it had been since they had seen a woman. One of the guys standing in front even licked his lips, looking slyly at the victim. He even promised to take care of her as soon as they had some fun. And leaning towards the girl face to face, the guy touched her head, frightening her even more. It became clear that it was Eiji Kagawa who, with an evil laugh, promised to be gentle. But everyone understood that this was a lie. Saliva flowed from the impudent man's mouth as he slowly ran his hand over the girl's chest. Sora noticed this and immediately dropped to the ground, noticing that some things don't change, and the non-entities remained as they were. Hearing someone's voice, the guys in armor threatened the young man that if he interfered, they would kill him immediately. And realizing that he wouldn't just leave him alone, the leader ordered the boy to be captured while he was having fun with the girl. The two guys grabbed their swords and quickly ran towards Sora, shouting death wishes. Sora didn't even move from his spot, not at all afraid for his life, knowing that it would be very easy to deal with them. As soon as one of the attackers was very close, the guy gave him a very strong slap in the face, quickly stunning the enemy. The guy who received the blow immediately fell to the ground. At that very moment, a sword appeared next to Sora's face. But the guy quickly interrupted the attack by grabbing the other's hand and starting to squeeze it with all his strength. And after hitting him in the face, the second attacker also fell to the ground lifeless. At this time, Eiji came up and had no choice but to intervene, and while he went to sort things out, the girl they wanted to attack managed to run away. Sora, seeing a familiar face, quietly said the guy's name, remembering how he pushed him out of the truck. And raising his head, the guy asked if he had really forgotten the face of the one he killed. Eiji began to tremble in horror, not believing that the guy was alive. The guy thought that this couldn't be, and out of fear, he even fell to the ground and started crawling backwards. Sora, having the opportunity to deal with the impudent man, menacingly appeared before the frightened Eiji. And suddenly standing up on his feet, the guy started shouting for them not to come near him, still not believing that the boy had been alive all this time. A sly smile appeared on Sora's face, and the guy suddenly reached out his hand to Eiji's face. Grabbing him by the throat, the guy began to squeeze his neck, causing Kagawa to choke without the ability to respond. And stating that it was his fault that he had to fight his way out of hell, Sora pushed the guy back while still holding him by the throat. There was fear on Eiji's face, and the boy understood that it seemed like he wouldn't leave here alive. Sora didn't even pay attention to the impudent guy's fear and shouted that now it was his time to go to hell. He grabbed Kagawa even harder, digging his nails into his neck, making small wounds. Having promised to take away every bit of his self-respect, the boy could no longer contain his anger, blaming only Eiji for what had happened, because he had ruined his life and separated him from his parents. The guy's anger was so great that voices began to speak in his head, telling him to kill the enemy, offering to subordinate everything to his will. In the past, all Eiji did was torment the boy. Every day, Sora experienced feelings of pain, humiliation, and helplessness. But today, he will finally be able to get it all back. And suddenly, a memory popped into his head of how Eiji had once strangled a guy, declaring that destroying a guy's self-respect was damn nice. These words made the guy stop abruptly. Letting go of his hand, Kagawa quickly fell to the ground, still gasping for breath. Trying to clear his throat, Eiji was afraid to even look up at the guy who simply froze in place. Sora realized that he couldn't become as cruel. But remembering what Eiji had done with the girl a couple of minutes ago, the guy still couldn't allow such worthless people to continue breathing. Thinking about this made the guy feel emotional, but not forget about revenge. Coming closer, Sora called over to Eiji, who was still coming to his senses. The guy said that since he tried to kill him and couldn't, then he would spare his life, but Sora still added that he wouldn't let him just leave. Looking at how Kagawa began to get nervous, the guy began to remember those 2 years of hell at school, how Eiji terrorized not only him, but the other weak students as well, and the way he threw him out of the back of the truck, trying to kill him. For all those horrible things, Eiji needs to get hit 4 times and then it will be all worth it. Kagawa, realizing that he could die even after the first blow, began to beg Sora not to do it, apologizing for everything he had done. Taking hold of the edge of the sweater, Sora slyly began to calm the guy down, telling him not to worry. Eiji seemed to start remembering all the moments of his life as he saw the boy swinging his arm to strike. And before he could think, Kagawa received his first blow to the face, which immediately stunned and confused him. The second blow seemed even stronger, and it seemed that the guy would not be able to withstand a third. With 2 blows to the face, Eiji began to bleed, which began to spread across the ground, frightening his 2 comrades. Without giving him a break, Sora struck a 3rd blow, remembering all the pain that this bastard had caused him. The boy decided to save the 4th blow, and after laughing a little, he ordered Eiji to stand up. Kagawa, kneeling down, barely alive and covered in bruises, abrasions, and blood, whispered for the guy to just kill him. And right after his words, Sora's foot flew into his face. This blow was the last one for him, and the guy decided not to hold back, and with all his might crushed Eiji's face into the ground. Eiji fell down dead, blood pouring from his eyes and showing no signs of life. He had no limbs or sight left, which greatly satisfied the young man. Seeing that Eiji was barely breathing, the boy told his friends to take him to the hospital. And before leaving, Sora shouted for them not to appear in his sight again. Leaving Eiji's body behind, the boy hurried further towards the shelter. Having dealt with the cleanup, it was time to move on to meet the parents. Believing that he would finally be home, Sora sped up as fast as he could to get there. It was already approaching evening. The sun was gradually sinking below the horizon, and no one knew what might happen at night. From the fallen zone, the guy found himself in the city's security zone. At the border, 3 soldiers in uniform stood and discussed their willingness to remain on guard duty on the wall. Everyone laughed, saying how good it was that they didn't have to fight monsters here, but it wasn't worth losing your head if you had to fight. The military's conversation was interrupted by First Lieutenant Tanji Kagura, level 31, reminding the soldiers not to let their guard down, because no one knows when monsters might come. But Private Shoki Matsura, a 22nd level warrior, said that the monsters would hardly get here, and, to everyone's surprise, immediately after the words, a monster suddenly attacked them, killing several soldiers in a matter of seconds. It was a child of a level 45 kraken, a shell-like monster that pierced its victims with its claws and stared at the rest with one of its large eyes. The military immediately opened fire, essentially trying to contain him at the border to prevent him from entering the safe zone. The monster itself was very strong, but the shots only made it even more angry, especially since the bullets did almost no damage to it. The soldiers realized that the monster was too high level and their weapons were simply powerless in this battle. The merciless beast meanwhile continued its advance, and it seemed that it would be able to cross the border. Kagura, commanding his soldiers, ordered everyone to disperse and take their positions. The kraken, with its sharp claws, cut the almost unarmed soldiers in 2 one after another. It was decided to run to the side to confuse the monster. One of the soldiers, holding explosives in his hand, began to attract attention to himself. And while he ran towards the monster to plant the bomb, the others continued to shoot, protecting the soldier. The kraken began to defend itself with its tentacles and shell, covering its large eye from bullets. The soldier with the bomb was already next to him, and it seemed that they had a chance of winning. And suddenly the monster began to behave strangely, raising its eyes upward, stopping killing the soldiers. The kraken seemed to be afraid of something, and the soldiers, not understanding what was going on, stopped firing. Covering its eyes with its tentacles, the beast began to back away, continuing to look up. The soldiers froze in place, not understanding what was happening. Everyone noticed that something had frightened the monster, but what could have frightened such a strong beast? The kraken began to gradually close its eye, as if it sensed the approach of danger. His pupil narrowed and his tentacles began to move in a chaotic manner, continuing to confuse the others. No one knew what he was afraid of, and so they had to be even more on guard. While everyone stood still, one of the soldiers thought this was a good opportunity to plant a bomb, and, grabbing the box, he rushed towards the monster. Having thrown an explosive device under the paws of the kraken and wished for death, everyone began to wait for what would happen. The soldiers barely had time to escape because the bomb exploded as soon as it hit the ground, stunning everyone around. Standing on the ground, the soldiers began to wait for the smoke to clear to see whether they had killed him or not. But the Kraken remained alive without a single scratch and only became even more angry, fixing its large eye on the soldiers. No one could believe that such a powerful bomb could not tear the animal apart. The Kraken's shell turned out to be so strong that it was not affected by fire or explosion, which made the situation even more serious. One of the soldiers was so scared that he couldn't even move and just looked at one of the beast's claws approaching him. But suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, Sora appeared, who saved the military man at the last moment. The guy began to brutally kill the monster, tearing off its limbs, and the beast began to gradually bleed out. The lieutenant, seeing how he mercilessly killed such a strong opponent, finally realized that it was this guy that the Kraken was afraid of. It wasn't long before the monster died, and Sora calmly walked forward, looking around. Kagura couldn't believe that this guy was able to survive the explosion and still kill the monster. People with such S-rank destructive power, and the man himself had never seen anyone like that. Continuing to look at him, the man decided at all costs to find out who he was, using his ability to look and see information about the target. And the closer the user is in level, the more accurate the information seen. The lieutenant, seeing such power for the first time, could not believe what was happening, but what he saw next made him freeze in place. A system warning appeared before his eyes, telling him to show his respect to this guy. Kagura only saw this warning, but he never received any information, as if it simply did not exist. From shock and helplessness, the man began to lose consciousness, but the military quickly caught the lieutenant. Sora calmly looked at the military while continuing to stand next to the monster's corpse. Seeing a soldier nearby, the guy stopped him, saying that he wanted to ask a question. Coming closer, the young man asked how far away the sixth shelter was, slightly confusing the military man. But he still answered that the shelter the guy was looking for was 5 to 10 kilometers to the north. But before getting there, the guy needed to go to Zone X. This was the first time Sora had heard about this zone, so he immediately recognized it. As it turns out, this zone is where the advance of monsters is held back. They are lured there to minimize damage from battles, and there were also many monster hunters there. Turning his head, Sora heard the soldiers marvel at the rare items that dropped after killing the monster. It became clear that when you win, in the real world, things drop from each kill just like in the game. Turning again to the soldier, the boy asked how strong this monster was for them. Level 45 was a pretty tough opponent for the military, and if it weren't for the guy, it seemed like they would die. Sora was a little surprised that even this was causing people difficulty. Having learned that there were no more than 100 monsters in that zone, the young man headed there, thinking that he would soon find himself in a shelter. But as soon as he turned around to leave, the soldier who had answered all his questions began to behave strangely, as if he wanted to say something. And having collected his thoughts, the man stopped the guy, not even knowing his name. Sora stopped, deciding to listen to the stranger. The soldier, stuttering a little, said that perhaps his request would sound strange, and bowing, expressing respect, he asked the guy to go to Zone X. The soldier explained that a strong hunter like Sora would save many people, of whom there were already few. The guy thought for a second and asked if this was the shortest route to shelter number 6, if he went through this zone. And having received a positive answer, the guy agreed to the man's request without hesitation. And before leaving, Sora promised to walk around the zone and kill all the monsters that were unfortunate enough to get in his way. Nearby in this area, there was a military camp on the front line, filled with various equipment and a warehouse with ammunition. In one of the tents, Kagura lay unconscious and was almost coming to his senses. One of the soldiers stayed next to the lieutenant the whole time, making sure that nothing happened to him. And when the man opened his eyes, he was very happy. Sitting down on the bed, the man immediately realized that he had been out for about 10 minutes. And to cheer up the lieutenant, the guy said that the monster dropped recovery items and it was they that helped the man quickly wake up. But all this was not so important for the man. He was only concerned about the guy who saved them from certain death. From the soldier, he learned that Sora had gone north. Realizing that it seemed that it would not be possible to talk to him, the man bowed his head and sighed languidly. But then he straightened up abruptly, realizing the words about the north. The soldier clarified that the guy headed towards the 6th shelter, which was very strange for everyone. Kagura even asked again, not believing that the stranger really went through Zone X, which was full of monsters. It was clear that the young man didn't care about such a large number of undead, because he didn't even hesitate for a second before heading there. Sighing, the lieutenant ordered an immediate call to the main command center. Such an order was clearly rare because the soldier stood in a stupor, even upon hearing these words. While the soldier ran to carry out the order, the man continued to sit on the couch, thinking that there was not much time left until the appointed time. And looking at the clock, it became clear that there were about 10 minutes left, which meant the man had to make it in time. A couple of minutes later, a soldier ran in, saying that he had sent a message on the emergency radio. And coming closer, I decided to ask why they needed to contact the command center. As it turned out, this mission was different from the previous ones, and the information was highly classified, so no one knew anything. Taking the electronic device, the man turned on the map, explaining that Zone X, which served as the base for the mission, was no longer the place where they were holding the monsters. Now it is a bombing zone where they dropped bombs at designated times. And the general staff was watching all this all the time, trying to keep this information secret. Meanwhile, the headquarters received an emergency call from Zone B-22. The chief commander Renji Kumagaya, a level 58 flame mage, immediately ordered him to be connected to the call, and the dispatcher quickly began to set up the connection. After a couple of seconds, the call was set up. Kagura appeared from the screen, stating his communication code BW3422, stating that he had new information. Having received permission, the man said that the mysterious hunter had gone to the bombing zone, and he knew nothing about this mission. Renji, sitting in a chair and taking a deep breath, declared that this was only the lieutenant's own mistake. But the man had something else very important to tell, and so he didn't even pay attention to it. Kagura felt it was necessary to urgently inform the boy about the upcoming bombing. And at first, the commander did not even take these words seriously. Realizing that there was not much time left, Kagura began to shout that this guy was very strong and everything must be done to prevent him from dying. The lieutenant's cry forced the commander to listen to the man. Renji, still sitting in his chair, asked what level this hunter was exactly, since the bombing had to be postponed for his sake. But Kagura didn't know the answer to this question, since the system didn't show anything. And in response, the commander just laughed. Renji, having no respect for his subordinates, asked why the lieutenant wanted him to urgently contact the guy. At this point, the man's assistant, who was standing next to him, intervened, stating that he would most likely be dead by the time the message arrived. Renji began to laugh, saying that the man lacked brains, but he had a talent for humor. And looking at the blonde sitting next to him, as if addressing her, the man said that it looked like the soldiers weren't trained well enough to be left alone. The commander was not in a position to interfere in the affairs of his subordinates outside his jurisdiction. And leaning towards the girl, he reminded her that if he reported to his superiors that someone was hindering the progress of the mission, that person would immediately be brought to justice. Western Commander Mie Tonosaki, a level 73 golem tamer to whom the man's words were addressed, wondered if Renji was seriously going to set up his man when they needed to deal with the enemy. Mentally calling him an idiot, the girl did not allow herself to answer. And yet, Kagura, who was trained so carefully, tries to save the stranger, even if it means canceling the mission. Feeling that something was wrong, the girl asked how strong this man was since they didn't even know his level. Kagura remained silent, not even knowing how to answer, realizing that he knew absolutely nothing about the guy. With tensions rising and few answers available, Mie decided to take a different approach. Standing up from her chair and crossing her arms, the girl turned to the lieutenant, realizing that he hardly had any intention of interfering with the plan. But if the man's reason was not convincing enough, the girl promised to personally hand him over to a military tribunal. These words made the man shudder, realizing that he needed to come up with the right words to save the guy. After scolding the lieutenant, Mie asked Renji if he was satisfied with this measure of restraint for his subordinates. The commander could not answer anything, because the girl did everything right. And sitting down in the chair, the man asked to name the reason why they should save this hunter. Kagura stated very clearly that the man killed a level 45 Kraken hatchling in one blow. Everyone suddenly fell silent at headquarters. It was clear that the guy was definitely a hunter with a rank higher than A, and Mie asked if he was an S-rank military man. Although this was impossible, since everyone with such a rank was on missions, and there were no confirmation signals coming from B-22. Mie, understanding the urgency of the situation, asked why Kagura didn't know the level of this person, even though he was able to see it. The man sighed and replied that he was unable to see the level this time. This news left everyone around stunned. But the lieutenant also added that when using the ability on the guy, he lost consciousness due to an overabundance of information. This meant that the guy was at least level 100. No one could say anything about all this news. The situation was becoming even more tense, and there was not much time left. Such strength was truly rare, and no one had ever seen such a person, which meant he could be of great help to the military. But for Renji, this was no reason to stop the mission they had been preparing for a very long time. Eastern Commander Nobuo Yuasa agreed with the man, saying that they could not stop their war plans for such a vague reason. This mission would involve thousands of troops from 4 different forces, and that would be enough to completely encircle the bombing and security zones. Yuasa also noted that the original plan was for the garrison soldiers to kill the remaining monsters after the bombing. But if you make an emergency alert, the monsters will react to the sound. And they will run to one place, and if this happens, the territory will fall instantly. And thousands of soldiers would die. And the man saw no point at all in saving one in exchange for thousands. It's too risky even for an S-rank hunter. Kagura could not allow such a strong man to be lost because he could be of great help to the military. And the only hope left was for me, who fell silent and thought about something. Having collected her thoughts, the girl finally made a decision. And she said she was rejecting the request, saying they couldn't spend that much effort and people to save just one. Kagura on the other side of the screen couldn't even respond. The connection was terminated immediately after the girl's answer, so the lieutenant didn't even have time to say anything. Everyone in the tent who heard the conversation immediately drooped. For the man himself, it was a huge failure. One of the soldiers tried to calm him down by saying that he had done all he could. But Kagura became upset as if he was trying even harder to contain his emotions. The final result was very important to him. But now, it was as if everything was just like that. While the lieutenant stood there thinking that he had lost such a strong man, one of the soldiers looked at the keys on his belt. The guy definitely has some kind of plan that could fix everything. Carefully reaching out his hand, the guy almost imperceptibly stole the lieutenant's keys. Kagura heard the sound of keys a few seconds later and quickly looked at his belt, not seeing them on him. Looking back, the man saw the boy running towards his car, ignoring the lieutenant's order for him to stop. The guy, getting into the car, knew that there was still time and it was worth trying to save that man. Kagura began shouting at Private Matsura to come back, otherwise he would be immediately court-martialed, and not only he could suffer. But the private didn't hear anyone and drove at full speed to save the person who was important to the lieutenant. The soldier who approached the man immediately asked if he needed to go after the fugitive. But Kagura adjusted his cap and declared that this should not be done. The man knew that the private had made this decision himself, and it would be up to him. Matsura, meanwhile, pressed the gas pedal as hard as he could in the hope that he would make it in time. The guy was driving so fast that he couldn't even think about anything. The private just looked at the road and believed that he could find the man. But he didn't yet know that the boy he was trying to save would become the hope of all humanity. And Sora himself had no idea that he could save the whole world from terrible destruction. At that moment, Matsura lost track of the guy, and there wasn't much time left. The guy began to urgently think where this man could go, remembering everything he said. And then he remembered how Sora asked about shelter and the shortest route. During this time, the guy could not have gone that far, which meant that he could move faster than the car. Driving further, Zone X began, where bombing was about to begin. Thinking about what to do, the private thought about a loudspeaker, and then the guy would be able to hear him. But then this would also give a tip to the monsters, which was very dangerous not only for Matsura, but also for the others. Looking at his watch, the guy realized that there were about 3 minutes left before the start of the task. He no longer cared if he died, and the private, without a second thought, turned on the radio for the loudspeaker. Taking a deep breath, the guy prepared himself for a very dangerous mission to save the strongest man. Slowing down a bit and passing by the ruins, Matsura thought for a moment about how best to say it so that the guy would definitely leave. He even caught himself thinking that he was a disgrace to the army for doing such absurd things. But it was too late to retreat and everything was at stake. Shouting into the radio, the private said that the soldier speaking was the one Sora had saved that time. And later, even louder, the guy declared that this area was about to be bombed, and that person needed to evacuate immediately. Sora was nearby at the time and heard these words almost immediately. Hearing about the bombing, the guy understood why there were no hunters here. And looking into the distance, Sora knew that the monsters were not at all scary to him. But it was unknown whether he could survive the heat from the explosion, and it was better to avoid senseless risks. Still hearing the loudspeaker, Sora noticed that the soldier had put his entire life on the line just to warn him, which was very humane of him, and so the boy couldn't let him die. Matsura at this time got out of the car looking into the distance in the hope that the man heard his message. There were literally just a couple of seconds left before the bomb fell, and the monsters didn't even suspect it at that time. But they heard Matsura's words and quickly headed towards the source of the sound. The private got back into the car and immediately noticed the huge monster, realizing that he had indeed attracted the attention of the monsters. So, quickly starting the car engine, the guy decided to get away from here as quickly as possible. There are about 10 seconds left before the bombing begins. But the private never saw that man, and having decided to abandon the idea of leaving here, the guy, on the contrary, went inside the zone. But suddenly someone knocked on the car window. Turning his head, Matsura saw a completely calm guy. Sora's first question was what he meant when he said something about bombing the zone. Casually glancing at his watch, the private couldn't even answer the guy, realizing that there was 1 second left before the explosion. As soon as the clock showed exactly 5 o'clock, the sounds of airplanes began to be heard from afar. The fast fighters began dropping bombs one after another, and the first explosion happened right next to the guys. Matsura began to panic, afraid to get out of the car while Sora himself stood calmly in place. It seemed as if a bomb was about to fall on them. Another explosion was heard almost nearby, burning all the ruins of the buildings to the ground. One of the building's fragments flew straight at the guy with the private, but Sora easily stopped the stone flying at him with his hand. At this time, the headquarters was in full swing observing the special operation. A couple of minutes after it began, the dispatcher announced that the bombing was complete. Renji immediately ordered the drones to be used to find out how many monsters they had killed and where the survivors were heading. The drones showed no signs of life, and as it turned out, the monsters were still in the bombed area, and those in the center of the bombing are completely unharmed. Renji stood up from his chair and screamed how this could even be possible. Me, remaining calm, immediately asked what the drones were showing. But the girl sitting at the monitor couldn't even move from what she saw. Everyone in the room froze in anticipation. All the monsters seemed to have formed dome-shaped shields, and so the bombs didn't even touch them. But what was strange was the unknown man with white hair and a black cloak among them. The man stood clearly among the merciless monsters and calmly headed with them to another zone. The drones were almost immediately attacked by monsters and broken, and surveillance ceased. Switching to another drone, the last thing that was visible was a huge monster with red eyes who just as quickly broke the device. And so all the devices broke down one after another. The monsters broke, bit, and destroyed every drone that flew near them. Eventually, the headquarters lost all contact with the surveillance cameras. Me remembered that they had already been told that this wave was different from the others, but no one understood what it was just now. And suddenly, the girl realized that all this time they knew about reconnaissance with drones. Yuasa looked around at everyone in horror. And realizing the full danger of the situation, the man shouted, ordering the evacuation of all soldiers from the garrison. Right behind him, Mi gave the order for a full retreat and to hold the walls. But the girl sitting at the monitor said in horror that the monsters were not heading towards the walls. At this news, everyone again fell silent in horror. Mi, without waiting for an answer, screamed, asking where they were going then. The girl pointed to the map on the monitor and said that the monsters were heading towards Zone B22. And then Mi remembered that this is where the mysterious hunter was heading, and why then would the evil spirits go to this guy? There was little time for guesswork, and the girl simply gave the order to send all the remaining drones to this zone and quickly find out what stopped the advance of the monsters. Meanwhile, the zone was almost empty. There was not a single sound, and no one was alive. Only the private and the guy stood still when they heard the bombs stop falling. After getting out of the car, Matsura looked at his hands, realizing that he was still alive. And overjoyed, the guy began to shout throughout the street that he had survived. But Sora stopped him, saying that it was too early to celebrate, because if they were alive, then the monsters were too, and they were definitely heading here. Suddenly, the guy quickly turned his head back, noticing something flying towards him. And shouting for the private to lie down, he dodged at the last moment. It was a fallen, broken drone, which the guys dodged in time. Matsura noticed that it was the monster that broke the drone, which usually never happened. But Sora said that it was too early to be surprised. It was necessary to understand how far the monsters were from them. Before they had time to relax, monsters of varying sizes and strengths began to approach them. Matsura looked at the arriving guests in horror, and what he saw when he raised his head only made him shake with fear. A huge monster, the size of a high-rise building in level 90, began to emerge from behind the houses. This was the highest level group in this influx, which gave very little chance of getting out of here. But what shocked the guy most was that not a single monster had a scratch after the bombing, and sitting on the ground, Matsura began to think that they were most likely finished. Sora noticed that they were both unharmed, and since the bombardment hadn't hit them, they could simply kill them all, which gave him more confidence. He ordered Matsura to hide in the jeep, and he himself rushed towards the crowd of monsters. Once close, Sora began flying straight through the monsters, cutting each one in half. Then the biggest and strongest monster intervened in the fight, and as soon as he swung at the guy, Sora managed to jump down. But a large hook on a chain, which was attached directly to the monster's hand, flew after the young man, but Sora quickly stopped it with his hand. Holding the enemy's weapon with one hand, the guy looked menacingly at the enemy, awaiting further action. The monster's glowing yellow eyes became visible, and he seemed to become uneasy. freezing in place while his weapon was held in a tight grip. Sora waited for a moment, pulled the hook down and flew up. Jumping above the head of the monster itself, the guy gathered all his strength to deliver a crushing blow. The monster began to get even more angry, and his eyes glowed red. And without giving the enemy time to think, Sora flew swiftly down to the very head of the monster. As soon as he got close, the guy flew through the monster's head, crushing it into small pieces. Having lowered himself onto the still-standing body of the monster, the young man noticed a second man who calmly continued to stand on the shoulder of the already decapitated monster. The stranger was wearing a cloak, so Sora couldn't see his face. From under the cloak, only long white hair fluttered in the wind. Looking closer, Sora noticed that he still hadn't sensed his presence, which was very strange. Finally, the stranger in the cloak suddenly stepped forward and whispered something. And after his words, the skin began to grow together at the place where the monster's head was cut off. The monster's bones began to regenerate, and branches of flesh emerged from where its head had been cut off. The stranger continued to bow his head over the place where his head had been restored, without moving from the spot. And in a matter of seconds, the monster's head was back on his shoulders and they both looked at Sora with furious smiles. The monster, looking with crazy eyes, shouted that the guy was a thief and that he should return what he took. But Sora still didn't understand what he had taken and what he had to give back. And then a stranger intervened in the conversation, who said that the guy had stolen someone else's power. Now he had to pay with his own life. Following the stranger's cries, black spears quickly flew at Sora. But the guy reacted quickly and managed to catch the spears. Clutching the remainder of the spear in his fist, the young man began to think that this was all the mysterious stranger was capable of. And confident in his abilities, Sora jumped towards the man, preparing to pierce him with his weapon. But before the guy could strike, the monster's hand began to move towards him, wanting to swat him like a fly. Having the advantage, Sora still quickly jumped back. At this time, a small drone was flying behind them the whole time, monitoring what was happening. The stranger began to think that Odin's raven was watching him. But upon closer inspection, he realized that it was an imitation created by people. Sora, meanwhile, effortlessly held back the monster's hand that wanted to slap him, and shouting to the stranger that if he wanted to kill him, then he should take it more seriously. After these words, the guy pointed the spear straight at the stranger, making it clear that he would not leave without a fight. Getting ahead of the curve, Sora jumped up to the man and struck him with his weapon. But in a matter of seconds, the spear only struck the monster's shoulder. Realizing that the man was gone, Sora wondered where he had disappeared to. The stranger quickly jumped to the ground. He stood and thought about how disgusting it was to be under the surveillance of vile little people. Considering humans to be low-class creatures and that they irritated him, the unknown person pointed his hand at the drone, which continued to fly around him. And immediately, the large demonic bird broke the flying object. The stranger ordered all his monsters to destroy every observer, but he himself remained standing in place, watching the falling drone. At this time, a man with a mask on his face was sitting in a nearby building, watching as a bird destroyed his drone. And looking at his tablet, the man thought that he had somehow managed to complete his task. But the reason the monsters changed course and didn't notice him was because Sora had captured the attention of every monster. He couldn't understand how such a hunter could deal with such an influx of monsters alone. And putting away the tablet, the man decided to quickly report this guy to the commander. But as soon as he stood up, some noise was heard outside the door. At that moment, a monster with tentacles burst into the building. And at the last moment, the man managed to step back, realizing that he had been discovered after all. Sora, hearing the screams, looked at the building where they were coming from and saw several monsters climbing up the skyscraper. The stranger continued to laugh madly all this time, ordering his servants to kill the man who was spying on them. For a moment, Sora stopped and thought. The guy remembered Matsura's words, who said that a strong hunter like him would save many people. The young man also recalled how this soldier helped him by going into a dangerous area and warning him about the danger. At this time, Matsura, hiding in the car, was unable to get out because his car was pinned down by stones. Sora saw that he couldn't help everyone at the same time, and this made the guy freeze in place, not understanding where to start. But suddenly, it finally dawned on him that when hunting enemies, you need to start with their leader. And jumping off the monster, the guy ran towards the stranger in the cloak. To save as many people as possible, you will have to quickly kill the enemies. Sora began to provoke the huge monster into a fight. But the monster itself, as if enraged, quickly struck the guy with stunning force, from which Sora only managed to jump back, unable to hit. The guy noticed how after merging with this person, the monster's striking power increased. Covering his face with his hands, Sora began to hit the monster again. But at that moment, a stranger in a cloak ran up, wanting to fight the guy one-on-one. The moment the unknown man looked at Sora, his attention was drawn to the stranger's face. To his surprise, the man in the cloak looked exactly like him. But there was no time to think about this, and Sora tensed up even more when a huge black sword appeared behind the stranger's back, without any even shape, as if he were a ghost. The guy felt a powerful surge of energy as soon as the weapon appeared, and it became clear that something was clearly wrong with this sword. Without waiting for anything, Sora's opponent shouted that he would kill the young man and rush towards him. At the last moment, Sora was able to dodge the sword coming towards him by jumping to the side. Stepping to the other side, the guy swung his arm and prepared to attack. Sora managed to hit the stranger's hand with all his strength, causing his sword to quickly fall to the ground. Having intercepted the weapon for himself, the young man jumped back, still not knowing how strong his enemy was. But now the advantage was on his side, and swinging his dark sword, Sora began to aim where to strike. The stranger looked at the guy in horror, not expecting that he would be able to intercept his sword in this way. When the sword was already close to Sora's enemy, he suddenly evaporated again, and the weapon hit the ground accompanied by a loud sound. Raising his head, the boy saw that the stranger was again on the shoulder of the large monster. Sora realized that this didn't work either, and maybe he imagined it. But the surge of that energy was very similar to the power of the abyss. Clutching the sword tighter in his hand, Sora seriously wondered who this person was. The stranger continued to stand on the giant's shoulder, the end of his tattered cloak beginning to flutter in the wind, turning into tentacles. After asking the guy why he could only steal other people's weapons, the man bared his teeth and looked down at the young man. Keeping his gaze fixed on the guy, the stranger suddenly waved his hand, and the sword in Sora's hands suddenly began to evaporate and then completely disappeared. But now it became clear that this was the power of the abyss, and it seemed to have a lot of uses that the guy didn't even know about. Reaching Matsura's car, Sora thought that the fight would drag on in this case, and the first thing he needed to do was get the soldier to a safe place. Approaching him, the guy immediately puzzled him with a strange question. Is he afraid of heights? Matsura had just replied that he wasn't afraid of heights when the car began to shake and rise higher. Sora grabbed the car with both hands and lifted it above his head, declaring that he would then have to fly. The stranger in the cloak saw what the guy was doing and started laughing, calling him a fool, and that he shouldn't treat the power of the abyss so frivolously, adding that the strong do not exist to protect the weak. He raised his hand upward, forming a strange red circle that looked like a portal, from the center of which tentacles were erupting. As it grew larger, it became clear that it was an eye of darkness that covered almost the entire sky above Sora's head. And wishing death on the boy and his weak friend, the stranger prepared to strike. But Sora was faster, and grabbing the car tighter, he ran with all his might away from the supposed place of impact. But after a while, it became clear that even if he accelerated, the enemy would catch up with him. So he put the car on the ground and decided to act differently. Deciding it would be easier to simply destroy the Eye of Darkness, Sora jumped straight into the massive circle. In flight, the guy managed to gather all his strength into a fist, and, squeezing it tighter, he rushed to strike the eye. Having cut the eye in two, the guy felt nothing and immediately thought that nothing had worked. But looking up, he saw another circle, which turned out to be the real form. Preparing to strike again at the real form of the Eye of Darkness, the guy heard a scream below. Sora looked down and saw the branches that obeyed the stranger begin to wrap around Matsura's car. In a panic, the young man quickly shouted at the soldier to get out of the car, but Matsura was so scared that he couldn't even move. Sora looked at what was happening in horror, realizing that he might not be able to save the soldier in time. And suddenly, the stranger's branches began to pierce the car, lifting it higher and higher into the sky. Having decided to save Matsura first, the boy jumped straight onto the black vines, tearing them apart one after another. A man in a cloak standing on the monster's shoulder appeared next to the guy in a matter of seconds, asking if he was angry. Sora, having broken another liana, remained silent, and coming closer to the car, the stranger took out Matsura's body, which was pierced by vines all over, but the guy continued to show small signs of life. Controlling him like a puppet, the man in the cloak, using necromancy, made the soldier smile, but it was already clear that it was not him, and most likely the soldier was already dead. The man laughed heartily, saying what a wonderful fate Sora had, since he was watching those he held dear die before his eyes. Sora didn't take his eyes off the unpleasant sight for a second. The boy immediately remembered the school bully who bullied him, and because of whom he was never able to meet his parents. Remembering this picture, Sora asked the stranger, did he also enjoy destroying other people's self-esteem? But the man in the cloak only continued to laugh heartily, doing something with his hands, and shouting that there was no need to state the obvious, he released an obsidian storm of a large number of sharp stones. The stones flew at Sora and began to cut him, flying at a furious speed. But the guy, getting more and more abrasions, continued to stand in place. Quickly dodging another wave of obsidian, the boy jumped down to the ground. Turning around and approaching from the other side, the guy was about to hit the base of the vines, screaming. Shouting that he was sick of the scumbags who brought only pain and suffering to others for pleasure, Sora was about to strike. The impact caused the car to fall and the man in the cloak disappeared, while Matsura flew down. Pushing off from the rock, Sora headed towards the soldier, and almost at the last moment he caught the soldier's body and landed on the ground with him. But when Sora looked at Matsura, he saw a dark face with red eyes and a crazy smile. Holding the soldier in his arms, the boy took one last look at Matsura. Sora's eyes showed regret for everything that was happening. Having apologized to the already distraught soldier, the guy locked him in the car. Before he had time to come to his senses, a stranger in a cloak stood behind him again, waiting for a fight. Sora, unable to control his anger, turned sharply and flew towards his opponent, clenching his fist tightly. The guy was going to destroy the bastard, but his enemy declared it was useless and prepared to quickly dodge. Unable to strike, Sora became even more angry until the stranger pulled out his black sword. Swinging his arm, the enemy called the guy a newbie who couldn't even handle the power of the abyss. But before he could finish speaking, he immediately got punched in the face. Sora's blow was so powerful that the stranger flew to the side, but even while flying from the blow, he continued to laugh. The flight did not last long, and the man in the cloak landed on the ground, accompanying his landing with a strong blow. Sora was pleased that he was finally able to hit his opponent and declared that he was no match for him. A man in a cloak sitting on the ground shouted that it was impossible. He couldn't understand how the guy was able to hit him at all, thinking that he wasn't as strong as he was. Sora, calling his opponent an idiot, added that people tend to change and ran up to his enemy again, raising his hand for a second blow. The stranger, seeing the guy's fist approaching him, began to think in fear what to do next, and not having come up with anything better, he again found himself on the shoulder of the big monster. Sora's opponent was able to guess that the young man had learned to control the power of the abyss by observing his actions. But while he was thinking, Sora himself suddenly disappeared from his field of vision, and the stranger began to look around in horror. Suddenly, the guy appeared from above, flying straight at his enemy. The young man's opponent dodged once again, quickly running down to the ground. Sora decided to change tactics, as the enemy could clearly continue to dodge direct blows or even run away. And so, the boy struck the large monster with all his strength, cutting it in two. From the shoulder to the end, Sora cut through one of the largest monsters on Earth. But the wound of the man in the cloak's servant began to heal again, just like last time. Seeing this technique again, Sora decided to change his plan of action again. After all, when he was able to inflict such a large wound on the monster, it became clear that he had to aim for the core of the real body. And showing all his rage, the young man firmly grabbed the core of the monster's body with one hand and began to tear it out of the large shell. Clutching the core from which vines were curling, Sora jumped upward, shouting that the monster would be crushed. The monster, looking at the guy flying down, only repeated that it was impossible. And suddenly the sun finally became visible, and the vines on the monster's body began to burn. The monster's body parts began to crumble and disintegrate one after another. Little by little, only ashes remained of the man in the cloak servant, and the burning pieces slowly fell to the ground, causing the monster to seem to disappear. Sora simply jumped down, flying past the smoldering monster. But this was not the end. And once on the ground, the guy, not hiding his anger, began to look for his main enemy, and pointing his hand at the stranger, Sora shouted that he was next, wanting to quickly deal with his enemy. The stranger with crazy eyes began to scream and, raising his hands above his head, began to form a unity of shadows that looked like a small red circle, after which the summoning took place and monsters of varying strength and power began to come running from all sides. They all growled ferociously, smoke poured out of their mouths and their eyes turned red. The monsters followed the scent of the summoning of the unity of shadows, and it was as if each one had gone mad, wanting only to quickly reach the target and tear it apart. More and more monsters gathered around the stranger in the cloak. He continued to hold the unity of shadows above his head, from which red threads began to burst forth, controlling the monsters. Sora continued to stand in place, covering his face with his hands while shadows filled the space around him, touching everything around him. After a couple of seconds, it seemed as if the shadow had swallowed everything, and the guy couldn't even see anything further than his outstretched arm. Suddenly, everything suddenly dissipated, and the stranger with the monsters simply disappeared. Sora looked into the distance in surprise, not understanding why his opponent would use such a technique just to escape. Deciding not to figure out where his enemy had disappeared to for now, the guy took off his outerwear and threw it on the floor, as it was ruined by the power of the unity of shadows. Having taken out the photo of his parents, the boy made sure that it remained undamaged and intact. After making sure there was no danger nearby, Sora headed to the car and opened the door to see Matsura's body lying there, lifeless. Sora thought with regret that the soldier probably had a family waiting for him too, and in order to convey at least some part of him to them, he tore the military tag from his neck, and then he carefully transferred Matsura's body to the ground, lightly covering it with earth. Clutching the token in his hand, Sora was beside himself with rage after fighting such a ruthless man. It was clear that the shadow-using guy was hardly finished, since he had absorbed so many shadows that he could attack at any moment now. But now the guy knew his opponent well enough and was ready for this attack to take revenge for everything he had done. Sora couldn't let him get to the shelter first, knowing that if he did, everyone would be dead, including his parents. And, deciding to get there as quickly as possible, the guy ran with all his might to the shelter, continuing to tightly clutch the token. After he escaped, the downed drones began to activate at the site where the battle took place. The drones quickly took off into the sky as if they were looking for someone. A little later, Mi arrived in the area with a squad of drone operators, ordering them to thoroughly inspect the area and make sure that not even a mouse could slip past them. With the rest of the soldiers, the girl went to explore the nearby area, climbing over the ruins of buildings. As they entered the combat zone, one of the operators reported to his commander that the monsters were already close. But Mi, standing on a pile of rubble, knew about this even without the drones. When the girl looked at the area where the monsters were supposed to be, she froze in wild surprise. Every single one of them was defeated and lay dead on the ground. Trying to figure out what happened here, the girl ordered to check the drone recordings and report if anything was found. Everywhere, there were clear signs of the battle that had taken place. Mi began to suspect that the powerful hunter had not only killed everyone, but had also survived the bombing. While examining the bodies of the monsters around, one of the soldiers shouted to the commander that he had found something. It turned out that one of the drones was lying on the ground, the one whose memory card was not damaged. Mi quickly ran up to the drone and picked up the tablet, wanting to finally find out what happened here. Having inserted the memory card into the device, the girl began to carefully examine the material recorded by the drone. On the screen, Private First Class Matsura was clearly visible heading into the bombing zone, and Sora was standing in front of him, and it became clear that this seemed to be the very same powerful hunter that Kagura had spoken of. While the girl was watching the rest of the videos, the soldiers were surveying the area around her to make sure the danger had passed. But suddenly, one of the soldiers saw a strange purple light. As he got closer, he saw a special energy potion that constantly increased the user's magical power, an A-rank weapon, an ancient royal dagger, and a third box-like item that could not be identified. Another soldier noticed his comrade freeze in place and immediately asked what he had found. But seeing such powerful objects, the man covered them with his body, lying that he had not found anything. The soldier immediately caught on to the lie and decided to check out what was going on himself by going down to where the objects were located. Seeing the rare items dropped by the influx boss, his eyes filled with desire to get them. But appropriating the items received by the detachment was a crime, and he immediately stopped his comrade and himself from such a temptation. But the young man holding the box in his hands remained silent, not wanting to give up such rare and powerful items. Having decided to bribe his friend, he offered to divide the fines and asked how exactly they would divide them. But the soldier immediately calmed him down, saying that he only needed the unknown box, and he could keep the sword and the potion for himself. The guy was also interested in this box, but he flatly refused to give it up since legendary items are always found in such boxes. Realizing that he couldn't take the item the easy way, the soldier's expression immediately changed, and frowning, he approached his colleague and grabbed him by the shoulders. Pinning him against the wall, the guy said he had no choice and would simply have to give up the item. In the end, the soldier who found these items, fearing that his identity would be exposed, kept the dagger with the potion and gave the box to a persistent colleague. It seemed that the guy who got the box was not like an ordinary soldier, because when he finally took it in his hands, his eyes turned red and he whispered that he had finally found the golem's relic. Evacuation shelter number 6 was already located near Sora. The shelter was surrounded by a high wall and was well defended. The guy, landing not far from him, immediately saw soldiers with large guns standing along the perimeter of the wall. It was clear that they had not yet been attacked, as people were calmly entering and leaving the shelter. As soon as Sora headed towards the entrance, the residents immediately noticed the strange man. The guy walked with a bare torso, A large number of scars were visible on his body, and everyone passing by him noticed it. At this time, Sora did not pay attention to the sidelong glances of those around him. He was trying to sense the presence of the stranger in the cloak. But to his surprise, the guy not only did not feel the presence of an enemy, but also did not sense anyone stronger than him. And since there were no strong people here, this place could be destroyed sooner or later. Sora was so deep in thought that he didn't even notice the man in the big hat standing in front of him. Looking up, the boy saw a man with a blindfold over his eyes, which made Sora think that he was blind. The stranger just smiled and said that the guy had very thick blood and asked if he had come from outside. The young man, not seeing the trick, answered honestly that he really did come from outside. And immediately after his answer, the blindfolded man laughed, saying that it was very pleasing. Noticing Sora's confusion, the stranger reassured him, stating that he had no evil intentions, but only wanted to buy information about the outside world. And taking a couple of banknotes from his wallet, the stranger added that the necessary information meant a lot to him. When Sora saw the money, he didn't even immediately recognize the currency and realized that it had most likely changed during his absence. But the money was useful, and he agreed to tell everything he knew. The man, handing over the money, was glad of the opportunity. But before that, Sora had a question. The guy was curious why the priest didn't call him Your Grace, thinking that the man was most likely pretending. Laughing, the man in the hat said that the guy was thinking correctly and that dressing like that was just his hobby. Sora, looking directly at the stranger, also asked about the blindfold, not really believing that this man was really blind. The man laughed and thought how persistent this guy was, but still, in order to get information, he decided to tell the truth. And removing the bandage, the stranger said that he had recently contracted an eye disease. Showing his eyes, Sora saw how his eyes began to glow with a bright light. And the guy could recognize this frightening light even with his eyes closed. He thought that perhaps the man had reasons for hiding his strength, but he still had to be careful with him, because most likely there was a wolf in sheep's clothing hiding in this shelter. Without thinking twice, Sora kindly asked what the man was interested in, and he was ready to answer everything he knew. The man, having put the blindfold back on, declared that he was interested in what was happening outside, pointing to the soldiers who had gathered on the walls. It was clear that they were preparing for battle, having received the best weapons. The man was sure that ordinary people did not notice it, but he himself heard the explosions, and so he was interested in what exactly was happening behind the walls of the shelter. Sora wondered how to answer this question because he still didn't know how much he could trust the stranger. And laughing slightly, the guy replied that, to be honest, he himself wasn't sure yet, because he had gone outside on business, and when he heard an explosion from the southwest, he got so scared that he dropped the letter and was forced to use a t-shirt as an improvised sign. The man in the hat gasped at what he heard, realizing that this guy was also hiding his strength. Having thanked the young man, the stranger gave him money, saying that he had helped him out a lot. As Sora watched the fake priest leave, he saw him walking alone in an unknown direction, which looked very strange. And then the guy wondered how many fighters of his level were actually here, realizing that he wouldn't be able to sense them anyway. As Sora entered the safe zone, he noticed how none of the soldiers were paying attention to him, allowing a suspicious person like him to move freely. Perhaps during his absence from this world, people began to treat people more leniently, since everyone had a common enemy. And after making sure that everything was fine, the guy headed deeper into the city. Later in the evening, Sora went to the clothing store, realizing that he couldn't walk around the city without outerwear. The money the masked man gave him came in very handy, and the boy was able to buy himself a new t-shirt and a raincoat. And now he could finally do what he came here for, find his parents. Walking out onto the main street, Sora looked around, wondering where they could live in this city. Having obtained the surviving photograph of his parents, the boy decided to start with the old-fashioned method. A cute girl just happened to be passing by him, and Sora gently approached her and touched her shoulder to get her to pay attention to him. Pointing to a photo of his parents, the guy calmly asked if the girl had seen these people. But as soon as the stranger saw the photo, she seemed to be afraid of something. The fear in her eyes was very clear, and just after looking at the photo, the girl immediately turned around and walked away in her direction, saying that she didn't know who it was. Sora was very surprised by such a reaction, seeing how the girl seemed to have seen a ghost. Looking around, the young man noticed that for some reason everyone in this city was on edge, noticing how one guy was snapping. Seeing this guy walking towards him, Sora decided to ask him about his parents. But as soon as the cocky guy snapped at him, Sora's expression quickly changed, making it clear that he was no match for him. The curly-haired boy, as if not afraid of the guy, declared that he did not look like a local. Pointing to the photo in his hands, the hooligan declared that interrogating people with a photo in the middle of the night was so last century. But Sora didn't even listen to the rest of his words and simply showed him the photo, asking again if he knew these people. But as soon as the bully saw the people in the photo, he immediately started asking where the guy got this photo from and why he knew these people. Showing that this made him nervous, the curly-haired guy asked what Sora's business was with them. And without hesitation, the guy declared that he was their son. The bully began to sharply shift his gaze from the guy to the photo and back, not believing that the little boy in the photo was him. Believing that Sora was truly their son, the bully took a step back, as if he was afraid of something. Just when the situation started to escalate, a car was driving at full speed behind the guy, straight towards him. The hooligan, seeing the approaching car, moved back, thinking that they were about to be hit. But Sora was determined to get answers, so he decided to show how strong he was and stopped the oncoming van with one hand, scaring everyone around him. The bully looked at the guy in horror, not believing that this man was so strong. Holding the car with one hand, Sora asked again about the parents in the photo and whether the guy had seen them. The curly-haired boy was so scared that he didn't even know what to answer and began to stutter. Deciding not to get into trouble, the bully began to speak as if he recognized Sora, saying that they hadn't seen each other for so long. And pointing his hand towards one of the streets, the guy added that Sora should go ahead and find his parents' house there. The young man calmly thanked the bully and slowly walked towards his parents, walking along the quiet street. The hooligan followed the guy with his eyes until the very last moment, smiling back at him. But as soon as he disappeared from sight, the guy ran somewhere with all his might, thinking that things were bad. At this time, calmly walking down the street, Sora wondered why this bandit knew where his relatives lived. After all, if you think about it, my father was kind to everyone he met, and for as long as he could remember, my father had always done good deeds. His mother was also the kindest person. But this world simply uses such good people. So it was strange that passers-by reacted this way to their photos. But now it didn't matter to Sora, because he was almost there and couldn't wait for the long-awaited meeting with his family. Coming out of the alley, he finally reached the supposed house that the bandit had mentioned. The house seemed to be separate from the others and was so big that the guy couldn't even believe that his parents lived there together. Coming closer, the young man remembered that many people had fled that day, and there were plenty of empty houses, so most likely his parents had simply occupied a vacant house. Finding himself near the door, the guy sighed anxiously and finally knocked on the door. As soon as he knocked, a joyful Sora immediately heard his father's painfully familiar voice, which immediately calmed him down. Opening the door, the man greeted the boy as if he didn't know his son. The young man was slightly embarrassed and panicked, not knowing what to answer as soon as he saw his father. The man looked very menacing, and with the same serious tone he asked who the guy was. But when he looked closer and recognized his son, he immediately gasped, not finding the right words. He couldn't believe that this guy was his son, and standing in the aisle, the man couldn't even move. Sora saw that the man didn't seem to fully believe what was happening, and he said his name again. The boy's father was so surprised that he couldn't answer. After a while, believing what was happening, the two sat down at the table at home. There was an awkward silence in the room when suddenly it was interrupted by my mother, who, entering the room, apologized for keeping me waiting. When the three of them sat down at the table, the man agreed with his wife that he found it hard to believe that Sora was their son, because he was nothing like the Sora he remembered. Exhaling and crossing his arms, the man declared that in such moments one must resort to this. Sora smiled slightly and clarified what exactly needed to be done. And then his father explained that the right thing to do would be to exchange secrets that only a father and son could know. Although the man didn't want to expose himself to his wife, but if the guy didn't answer the questions, he wouldn't leave here unharmed. And before that, the man quietly turned to someone in the corner, saying that if Sora said anything even slightly suspicious, let them deal with him. It turns out that at that time a masked man was sitting behind the wall, ready to carry out the order. Even though the man tried not to show it, Sora immediately realized that his father was definitely being cautious, since he was using an accomplice. Seeing the boy looking into the corner, the man reassured him, saying that with such reliable security he could relax. Exhaling, the guy joked to himself that now Mr. Accomplice would hear something he shouldn't. The first thing the man asked was what he did every weekend, and Sora calmly sipped his tea and said that his father attended culinary support groups for housewives. The man's surprise knew no bounds when he heard the answer, not believing that the guy had answered this question absolutely correctly. The assistant sitting behind the wall quietly laughed when he heard that his master had attended such courses, and to make sure the man believed it, Sora added that he secretly went to ballet classes every week. This news completely finished off the accomplice, who could hardly believe in his boss's stable image. Hearing a quiet laugh, the man immediately turned and looked menacingly into the corner, hinting to the servant that this should remain a secret. The accomplice, frightened by the gentleman, immediately fell silent and continued to watch the guy so that if anything happened, he could immediately attack him. The boy's father stood up without saying anything, thinking about what had been said. Everything the guy answered could only be known by his son. But the man still didn't really believe the guy, because he didn't look like the real Sora at all. The young man immediately realized that they didn't believe him, and so he offered to tell them something intimate about the family. The man liked this idea, and as if trying to irritate him, he asked if the guy could convince him. Sora, of course, answered, "I can, but don't say later that you weren't warned that this is a secret." The boy's worried father, covered in sweat from excitement, even stood up in anticipation of what his supposed son would say. And in a completely calm voice, Sora pointed to two swords standing against the wall and declared that one of the Japanese swords was simply a copy. The man's accomplice tensed up and was ready to attack, and the man himself laughed in his son's face, asking if he had any proof of such serious words. Sora, without thinking, walked up to the weapon and, drawing it, pointed to the handle where his brother's bite was visible. The man's servant couldn't believe what was said, because the whole house thought that this dent appeared at the moment when the leader's hands were tied and he grabbed the sword with his teeth, killing 38 people. After examining the sword, Sora calmly put the weapon back in place, thinking that he had finally been able to prove his relationship with the family. At this time, the man's accomplice began to think that this guy was just pretending, suspecting that his goal was to lull the leader's vigilance and finish him off. Sora continued to examine the second sword, saying that it was retractable. Standing with his back to his parents, the boy didn't even see the faces of his parents, who were looking at their son full length in complete shock. It was only when he heard the man call someone an idiot that Sora turned around, and immediately he found himself in the tight embrace of his father, who whispered that he thought they had lost him. The man, crying bitterly, shouted how glad he was that Sora was finally home. Unable to contain his emotions, the boy's father continued to shout, as if he wanted to tell everyone that his son had finally returned. After all, when he went missing, the man searched every inch of land for his son, and before he could even process the loss, he became the boss. And now this very boss is shedding tears like a nobody, the man thought, continuing to hug his missing son. The accomplice, sitting behind the wall, froze in place, observing his boss in a completely different light. He spent his whole life under a rain of blood, knocking out status through his own efforts. But he had never seen anything like it and could never have imagined that the head could be so soft. At that moment, the accomplice realized that he had found the head of the family, a man who values honor above all else in such a state. And in order to avoid trouble, he decided to quickly disappear, pretending that he had not seen this picture. But as soon as the accomplice started to climb along the roof, someone suddenly grabbed him by the leg, and turning around, he noticed Sora, who said in a sweet voice that his father wanted to talk to him. It was already long past midnight, the moon was high, and a sleeping silence reigned all around. All four sat down at the table, and the boy's mother kindly poured tea. The man turned to an accomplice named Ochia and said that he had the longest tongue in the house, and Sora added that if anyone finds out about what happened here, things could get very bad for them. In one voice, father and son added that in that case the blame would be on Ochie. The accomplice, without raising his head, swore to keep his mouth shut, promising that he would never talk about today. Although he never looked up, Ochia could feel both of them looking at him menacingly. Sora's mother intervened, telling her husband that he shouldn't scare the boy. Ochia, who did not expect this, raised his head with tears in his eyes, calling the woman mother. And in the same sweet and calm voice, Sora's mother nevertheless declared that the boy really should keep quiet. Ochia bowed obediently once again, promising to remain silent. He wanted to leave the house as quickly as possible to avoid getting into trouble. As soon as only family members were left in the room, the man began to laugh, happy that at least his son hadn't told him that he snores and farts in his sleep. And Sora, watching his family smile and chat at the table, finally felt as if he had finally escaped the abyss and felt peace. The guy could finally feel at home and relax in this pleasant family atmosphere. Suddenly, while the family was discussing what had happened and drinking tea, the guy felt someone approaching their house. And at that very moment, the door to the room opened, and Sora heard a very familiar voice. The same curly-haired bandit stood at the door with a gang of the same hooligans and shouted that the fair-haired guy was looking for a man. An awkward silence fell over the room. The parents continued to calmly drink tea, and the boy looked at the arriving bandits with a smile on his face. Turning around, Sora asked with irony in his voice if the bully was talking about him. Seeing the guy, the bandit was a little confused, not understanding how this guy ended up there. And after realizing what was happening here, the curly-haired guy screamed in horror, and pointing at the guy, he added that even though he was strong, There were more of them, and he and the others would quickly deal with him. The bandit thought that Sora was planning to do something to their boss, suspecting that he was from the tiger's roar. Seeing that the guy was not calming down and continued to scream, Sora grabbed him by the legs, forcing him to shut up for a second. The guy showed with his gaze that he was definitely stronger than this bandit, which is why the curly-haired hooligan immediately fell silent. And turning to his father, the young man offered to introduce them to his assistants. The man, with a smile on his face, firmly stated that this was his son, who had disappeared 5 years ago and had finally returned. The man also wanted to talk about his son's level, but suddenly fell silent. In a panic, he realized that he had no idea what his level was. Sora looked at his father and calmly replied that he didn't have a system and that he didn't even know his level. The other bandits immediately started bombarding him with questions about how he had survived in the Fallen Zones for 5 years without a system. And the curly-haired guy, as if he had guessed something, still couldn't calm his surprise. But he thought that no matter how hard Sora trained, he wouldn't be able to rise above level 10. Suddenly, one of the bandits began to reproach the curly-haired guy, remembering how he screamed in horror that this guy was strong, but in fact he didn't even have a system. To deflect suspicion, the hooligan simply joked that he was probably mistaken. But in his eyes, if Sora really was a rookie, he couldn't understand how the boy had managed to escape unharmed from that collision with the car. The young man continued to look menacingly at the bandit, realizing that no one even suspected how strong he was. And so Sora suggested testing his level with his system. The hooligan looked questioningly at the guy, realizing that he was probably joking and that most likely his strength was very weak. And to make it clear, he explained that since Sora didn't have a system, he probably didn't have the basic information. The bandit added that the system allows you to see the levels of monsters. But if there is no special ability, then nothing will work, and they will never know the level of power. Inspection was a rare ability and not all hunters had it. And in that case, Sora suggested that his father himself would look at his level. The guy wasn't so interested in finding out his level, because he was sure that it was high enough. But Sora still wanted to get at least some information about the abyss. The moon was already quite high in the sky. Everyone was sleeping peacefully in their homes, while heated discussions were taking place in Sora's family's house. The boy's father sat down at the table, and the rest of the bandits, who also wanted to find out the level of their boss's son, stood behind him. Seeing the boy's mother standing to the side, Sora asked if she wanted to see his level. But the woman, with a smile on her face, replied that it was enough for her that her son was now nearby and, besides, she would find out anyway. But when the man looked at the system, he and the person sitting next to him froze in surprise, staring at the system screen. No matter how much the man tried, the result was the same. Or rather, no result was visible at all, and the system only showed question marks. It was a big mystery for everyone in the house because no one had ever seen anything like it before. The man knew there were only 2 reasons for this, one of which was that Sora had no system. But the second reason frightened the man more, because in this case the guy's level is simply so great that it is not subject to the system. And yet, the boy's father saw the information and his son's name in the system, which means she definitely saw him. Moreover, it was clear that Sora had survived for 5 years, and if he had been a newbie, he would have definitely died by now. It became clear that Sora's level was too high for his father to see him, which made the man wonder what the boy had been doing all these 5 years. The boy's mother intervened in the conversation, saying that shouldn't they just be happy about their son's return and not forget about his level. With a smirk on her face, the woman added that Sora was a strong boy, believing in her son's abilities. Taking the guy by the face, the woman gently replied that he probably had to go through a lot to come back. But then, Sora finally remembered what he went through when he lost his parents. The guy remembered how he killed, how crazy he became in the abyss, and that now he would definitely not become the same as before. The memories brought tears to his eyes, and hugging his mother, the guy only whispered that he was finally home and now everything would be fine. Touched by the words, the boy's mother also began to cry, unable to contain her emotions in front of everyone. Sora's father, seeing his family finally reunited, also couldn't hold back his tears, realizing that finding out the level was not so important now. He asked his guys to leave. The bandits, still wanting to find out the guy's level, didn't want to leave, but the man told them to get out, leaving the mother and her child alone, who hadn't seen each other for so long. The men themselves followed them out, quietly closing the door behind them. And when they found themselves outside, the man asked about Jiro, remembering that 2 hours had already passed and he still hadn't returned. Finally, everyone calmed down, and Sora was able to calmly discuss what happened with his mother. The guy was able to ask the question that had been bothering him for a long time. what happened to his brother. Sora was very afraid to hear that he was gone, but the mother reassured her son, saying that he was fine and that he was just in the army right now. Taking out her phone, she showed him a photo of him standing in a military uniform, saying that her brother had been fighting on the front lines all this time, as if wanting to avenge Sora. The boy, hearing his mother's words, remembered how his brother constantly stood up for him in childhood. Rejoicing for his family, Sora also asked if his mother held a high position here, and the woman answered with complete confidence that this was so and that no one here would harm her. But the reason why she is respected here is that she is a priestess who has many healing abilities, which allows her to provide great support. And the woman also added that she can make prophecies. And then it seemed to dawn on the guy that since his mother was a priestess, she could probably see right through him. But the woman calmly reassured her son, saying that she did not see other people's abilities. But she also added that once she learned that she could make prophecies, she knew that Sora would definitely return home. Glad that he was finally home, the woman lightly patted the guy, holding his face. While the son and mother were talking for half the night, someone unexpectedly came to their house. The guard who opened the doors to the courtyard cautiously asked who had come. In front of him stood the vice chief, a menacing man with a large guard behind him, and the man himself looked like someone very strong. Sora's father joyfully greeted the man, greeting him with his assistants, and the vice head of the Unification Guild, Jiro Iwashima, calmly entered the courtyard, maintaining his serious face. Sora's father immediately noticed that Jiro seemed sad about something and immediately asked what was wrong. Coming closer, the man asked Jiro if they had managed to observe from behind the scenes and how things were going with what he had asked for. The man told his boss that, as he suspected, the Tiger's Roar had joined forces with the army. Jiro explained that they had given the army the monster carcasses as usual, but one guy with a laptop started picking on him during the inspection. He made up excuses and gave them only half the points, although he reported the full value to his superiors, and during the inspection, the entire difference went to the Tiger's Roar. The man, having listened to his assistant, began to think about what he had heard. Tiger Roar, who should remain neutral, is already doing something similar, which means things will get worse. After listening to the report, the man suggested that Jiro rest and eat for now, adding that he would deal with it himself later. Having drawn his ghostly sword, the man decided to settle this matter, as it could not go on for much longer. It was necessary to show that the Unification Guild was not naive and would not fall for such tricks. At this time, Sora was discussing the Tiger's Roar with his mother. The guy learned that thanks to that dark fragment, all of the woman's abilities were working at full capacity, and not only them, but her senses were also heightened, and now she could even hear from afar. But Sora, having heard about the Tiger's Roar, understood that Kagawa and those bandits were connected to him, which is why the boy began to worry about his father, who wanted to figure it out. Getting up from the table, the guy headed for the exit and immediately ran into Jiro passing by with his security. The boy, noticing his father, expressed his desire to go with him to the Tiger's Roar. The curly-haired bandit, hearing this, realized that this was his chance to find out how strong this young man was. At this time, Jiro looked questioningly at the guy, not understanding who he was. Thinking that he might pose a threat, the man immediately asked his boss who he was. But the boy's father reassured him, saying that it was his son, who had disappeared in the Fallen Zone 5 years ago. As soon as Jiro heard that Sora had been alone in the Fallen Zone for 5 years, he immediately became curious about his level. But the boy's father only replied that he had no system. Jiro thought that he was an ordinary person, but without a system in any shelter you would become a dead man without lasting more than 3 days. There's certainly a chance of survival with elite statistics and good survival skills, but without professional skills, you'll become dead weight faster than it gets to the fight. Thinking about this, Jiro only joyfully exclaimed that this was very good news, and since he had just returned, he was probably tired, which meant the guy should stay here. The man agreed with the vice chief and therefore asked Sora to stay at home with his mother. The mother, supporting her husband's idea, suggested that her son show her the house and its grounds. And then Sora realized that they probably thought he would be useless in a fight, although this was to be expected, because to people with the system, he was an ordinary person. But if he thought about it, he still hadn't gotten a complete picture of this shelter. And since there were monsters targeting him, it was better to hide his power so as not to involve his family. And Sora, in that case, simply agreed to stay home with his mother. The curly-haired bandit snorted at the guy, realizing that he had missed the chance to see his strength in person. And having resolved all the issues, the boy's father ordered everyone else to follow him. And Sora quietly watched his father leave. Seeing her son's anxiety, the woman asked him not to be so afraid, saying that the father was simply worried about his son. Approaching her son, the boy's mother added that they met after a long time and he did not want to put him in danger. After patting Sora on the head, the woman added that she constantly turns to visions to see the future, and this time they say that everything will be fine. Sora didn't like that his mother was treating him like a child again and quickly moved away. The boy began to wonder if his mother really did make predictions to foresee danger. But the tiger's roar had contacted the army, so his father would be in conflict more often. Turning to his mother, Sora carefully asked what the situation was like in the shelter and why the tiger's roar was treating them badly. And then the woman explained that after the Hunters Guild's Judgment Day, the Awakened joined forces with the military to manage the shelters, and Sora's father created a unification guild and collaborated with the army here, in the 6th shelter, hoping to find his son. The guild grew greatly as everyone in them was driven to find their family members. They themselves are busy maintaining order, collecting supplies on the battlefield and fighting monsters, while the military is involved in breakthroughs and attacks on towers. And so Sora's family managed to keep this place for 4 whole years. But a few months ago, a large hunters guild from the 4th shelter, Tiger's Roar, came here to establish its branch. Since then, conflicts between guilds have not ceased. Sora became curious why the military didn't intervene, thinking that this would solve everything. But his mother explained that the enemies were getting stronger and the army could no longer hold them back. But the Tiger Roar volunteered to clear the towers, and its power became so great that the military had to rely on their organization. The information about the tower raids was so valuable that it could not be ignored. Moreover, in the Tiger's Roar, there was an awakened being, chosen by the tower's deity. His name was Asura. He himself looked very large and menacing, and it was he who was the trump card of the Tiger's Roar. After the story, the boy became curious and wanted to know more about the tower's deity. As it turns out, there are tower heads. Their power is almost comparable to divine in the human understanding. And if you pass the test of the deity, you can become an Esser and receive divine power. And outside the tower, they are considered gods, and they also become guardians inside the walls of the towers. Tiger Roar currently has the most ESRs, and since each ESR has absurd power, Tiger Roar quickly consumes all neighboring guilds. Sora's mother said that the locals love his father's guild, but she herself has never cleared the towers, and they are the only ones in the Union who suffer without Ezra. It all sounded very bad, and Sora realized that the situation was not going in the family's favor. But the guy had a question. Why do the guild members act like Yakuza if people love them? Laughing sheepishly, the boy's mother stated that it was her personal preference. Sora looked at his mother in surprise as if he didn't recognize her. But the woman added that now they are happy and there is no difference at all. After finishing the conversation, the young man's mother suggested that he go take a bath, thinking that he was already tired. Entering the bathroom, the woman sweetly told the guy that if he wanted her to rub his back, he should call. But Sora was very embarrassed by this offer and reminded her that he was no longer a child. Leaving the guy alone, the woman continued to admire how her son had already grown up. Once Sora was alone, he was finally able to exhale. Closing his eyes, he checked with his senses that his mother had really left, as if he could see her through the walls. Looking out the window, the young man realized that he had not even suspected that the situation was so serious. Sora couldn't stay calm, and opening the bathroom window, the boy decided to help his father. Quickly jumping out of the window, Sora headed towards the Tiger's Roar without looking back. At this time, the young man's mother stood near the window and watched as her son quickly moved away. Sighing, the woman remembered how difficult it can be with children. Meanwhile, Sakuya went to the Tiger Roar with the members of the Unification Guild. At this time, Sora, having stopped on a tall building, saw that the light was only on in the center, which was very good for the guy because then it would be easier to find the way. Looking into the distance, the guy thought over his plan of action. But suddenly his head began to spin and his vision began to darken. It was strange for Sora, because even after he was strengthened by the fragment of the abyss, he didn't even catch a cold. And suddenly he heard someone talking about the seed of the abyss, and that it would not let him escape. The guy remembered this voice very clearly and immediately realized that it was the man in the cloak. But he hid his presence well, and the guy could not sense his location at all. But this meant that he had nevertheless made it into the shelter. And suddenly, Sora's head began to spin, and the guy himself began to lose his balance, clutching his head. He heard the familiar voice again, insisting that it would not let him escape. The voice whispered that the problem was in his soul, while Sora panicked and tried to understand what was happening to him. And suddenly, as soon as the voice declared that the soul was marked by it, Sora saw this person next to him as soon as he turned his head. The guy jumped back in surprise, thinking that there would be a big fight now. But running his hand over the image of the man, it dawned on him that it was just an illusion. The image of this man continued to say that the guy's soul was marked by him. The stranger laughed sharply, shouting that he would not let him escape. Just when the guy wanted to do something, a large lantern suddenly shone on him, and someone asked what he was doing on the roof of the building at such a late hour. Sora knew he had been discovered because the illusion was screaming loudly, so he quickly ran away. Pushing off hard from the roof of the building, the young man tried to hide from everyone. While he was flying, the guy tried to understand whether his illusion had disappeared or not. Having landed in a quiet place, he looked around himself again. And as soon as he stood up again, the illusion appeared again next to him, continuing to insist that it would not let him escape. Looking at her, Sora remembered that she disappeared as soon as the light was shown on him, and perhaps this was a way to get rid of her. And to make sure of this, Sora decided to check it out right away. Having descended to the ground, the young man stood under a street lamp waiting to see what would happen next. And as it turned out, he was right. The light really did not allow the illusion to appear next to him, and it was like a temporary salvation. After counting his pulse, the guy realized that as soon as he was in the dark for 7 seconds, the mark was activated and his head began to spin. But when he loses his composure, the line changes every time. Seeing the illusion again, the guy seemed to repeat after this man the words about how his soul was marked. His cry quickly attracted the attention of passing residents, which made the guy slightly embarrassed. Stepping aside, Sora grabbed his head again, realizing that when he stepped into the light, a piercing noise began to sound in his head. But after a while, the mark goes away, and he stopped seeing this person. Oddly enough, this hadn't happened before because he was in a room with light. But now he needed to figure out how to control it outside. Once again, when Sora walked down the dark street, the illusion of that man again began to talk about the seed of the abyss. This put him and the boy's entire family at risk, because then the stranger could find him, and above all, to launch a surprise attack at any time, and therefore Sora had to remain vigilant. But first he needed to find his father and try to ignore the stranger. But the truth is, the guy was increasingly attracting sidelong glances from passers-by every time he tried to talk to the voice in his head. Trying to maintain his composure, Sora slowly headed off to look for his father. Every time the guy passed by passing cars, he noticed the glowing headlights. And then it became clear that a person does not appear in the light. And if everything is as Mom said, the military no longer needs the Unification Guild, which means Dad could be in danger. But it was still unclear how many strong people were in this shelter, given that one of them was already definitely approaching the guy asking for information from the outside. But the army in alliance with the Tiger's Roar will never sit on the sidelines, and there is a very high chance that they will try to destroy the Unification Guild. In that case, Sora gave his word to protect his parents even if he had to kill everyone. After all these thoughts, the guy suddenly stopped in the middle of the street. Sora realized that it was unlikely that he would be able to return to the former peaceful days, and that things would definitely not be like before. Looking ahead, the guy noticed a large crowd of people in front of him, who were simply standing in place. It seemed he had managed to reach the right place, and in order not to attract attention, the guy hid behind a pole and began to observe. Sora was very interested in how his father would conduct the conversation, remembering what he was like before. After all, 5 years ago, his father always taught him that in conflicts, cruelty is the last resort. And Sora forever remembered his father's wise words. It seemed to the guy that even now he would endure until the very end, trying to resolve everything peacefully. But suddenly, his attention was drawn to a sharp sound coming from a large crowd of people. Coming closer, the guy heard the guild people shouting that it was about to begin, letting out joyful cries. Everyone was shouting how the boss hadn't drawn his sword for a long time. And then the young man saw his father, who was actually about to draw his sword. From the conversations, Sora heard how the last time his father left a nearly 20-centimeter scar on his opponent. Looking closer, Sora saw how his father seemed to change, releasing all his anger. Sakuya challenged Tsuchida to a fight and began to shout louder and louder, allowing everyone to pay attention to him. The man shouted at his enemy to finally come out and fight him. And to show his intentions and power, the man brought down a tall abandoned building with just one blow. Sakuya's eyes were full of rage, and steam was coming off of him because of his anger. Jiro and his assistants watched the battle, and each of the guild expressed joy at seeing their boss back in action. Sora was beyond amazed. He couldn't believe that this man was his father and that he was immediately rushing into battle. Stopping in front of the building, Sakuya began to wait for his opponent, provoking him more and more. Noticing something amiss, the man tensed up slightly, trying not to show fear in front of his subordinates. Sora still decided to come closer and even address one of the guys in the crowd. Almost calling Sakuya father, Sora asked if the boss had always been like this. One of the guys, noticing the young man, smiled slightly, and said that their boss was known for rushing into battle without thinking, taking everything from the enemy at once. Sora, surprised by this, even asked why his father hadn't said that cruelty is the last resort. As it turned out, the man had indeed spoken about this at first. But back then he still believed that the military would sort everything out. Much water has flowed under the bridge since then, and the military doesn't care about skirmishes as long as the hunters do their job and the civilians aren't starving, and they won't bother trying to break things up. That's why the fastest way to resolve a problem is with your fists. And if you can't win in a fight, there's no point in opening your mouth because talking won't help at all. And finally, the man added, hit first, talk later. But Sora thought that the strong avoid fights judging by the monk, but now everything became clear. The guy realized that now, perhaps, it is possible to go wild if you have the same strength as his father. The guy even thought that this was why the monk closed his eyes. At this time, the silhouette of an unknown person was visible on the building and on the other side of the city. It was the same monk who watched from the side as the soldiers removed the body of the large monster that Sora had killed that time. Yukio Shuzenji, a level 75 Arhat, looked into the distance, watching the military clear the area. In that moment, the man activated his keen eye, causing his eyes to glow just like the last time he saw Sora. Yukio saw a level 90 monster that looked like it had been torn apart, but there were no signs of heavy weapons or anything else on it. Having put on the blindfold, the monk thought how scared he was by how many strong people there were, and that he should act carefully. And as soon as the blindfold was on his eyes, his level immediately dropped to 45. Meanwhile, Sora's father continued to wait for his opponent. And then someone shouted, calling for a man named Mukujima. A man in armor came out of the building, followed by other people armed with whatever they could. Sakuya continued to stand in his place, glad that the enemy had finally come out and justice would soon be done. Sora's father shouted that he should have finished off the enemy back then, and he definitely wouldn't miss the chance now. But the man in armor, as if mockingly, suggested doing it right now if Sakuya wasn't afraid. The boy's father, showing all his determination, declared that he would not let this go unpunished and would definitely deal with it. Grabbing his sword, the man began to gradually draw it, preparing for the fight. Such impudence only further angered the armored enemy, who no longer could stand the guild. But suddenly a voice was heard behind him, which declared that he had provoked Sakuya enough, and now it was time to leave. Deciding to provoke him even more, the man laughed that he couldn't even draw his sword, and Sakuya could no longer withstand such impudence. The man continued to shout that it would be better for the Unification Guild boss to become the fuel for the tiger's roar. And then Sakuya's patience snapped, and suddenly drawing his sword, he ran straight at his opponent, swinging his weapon well. The man from the tiger's roar quickly reacted and put his large shield directly under the blow, and it seemed as if someone was protecting this shield and increasing its strength. Suddenly, someone started laughing madly behind the crowd of tiger roars while the man held his shield. Sakuya, striking the man with his sword, suddenly saw someone coming out of the crowd. It was Osamu Usui, a level 63 assassin who stepped forward and declared, "How could the boss even have the nerve to start a fight in the hideout?" Seeing the man from the army, Sakuya's people began to whisper, not expecting that he really was on the side of the tiger's roar. Sora immediately noticed that this was the same soldier who supported the enemy guild. Looking up, the guy felt that there were many people hiding in the building from which the tiger's roar came. It seemed as if Osamu had come here for a reason, and that the tiger's roar had its own plan for today. Usui, fearless of anyone, stepped forward and looked at the boss of the Unification Guild. At this time, Sakuya quickly realized that the soldier was helping Tiger Roar, causing his guild to suffer losses. As soon as the armored man put away his shield, Osamu, looking at his tablet, stated that according to Article 15 of the Temporary Shelter Security Law, duels were prohibited, and violators could be punished with imprisonment for 15 days or even death, depending on the severity of the offense. Laughing, the man asked if Mukujima would agree to carry out their order. Sakuya finally realized that this was their plan all along, to first provoke him and then use the law to arrest him. None of them were worried about Osamu's corruption being discovered, but the man still couldn't believe they had decided to set him up so brazenly. Once he's in prison, they can extend Sakuya's sentence indefinitely, or even make him disappear by accident. And in that case, without him, the Unification Guild will fall from the tiger's roar and the rest. But the question remained why the military was going so far to upset the imbalance, and whether there was a power struggle going on among them. Sakuya couldn't know exactly what they were planning, but there was no way he could confess to the crime. And putting away the sword, the man declared that Osamu was apparently mistaken since there had been no duel. Sora's father, as a supporter of the Unification Guild, could not confess to the crime without evidence. And then Osamu noted that the mark on the building looked like clear evidence of a duel. The man laughed anxiously, thinking he was joking. He then added that this was indeed evidence, but only that he was trying to reinterpret the building and not as a duel. Osamu, seeing such impudence, came closer to the man and asked that it seemed he did not understand him. And pointing to Sakuya's sword, he added that it was up to him to decide here, and not a guild member. And if he said that this indicated a duel, then that was the case. And suddenly soldiers started emerging from the building, pointing their machine guns straight at the entire guild. The situation became very tense, and Sakuya backed away, not knowing what to do. His men also began to get nervous, asking the boss what they should do. The curly-haired bandit suggested that since they had decided so, they could simply fight them, but the man asked them not to take any action for now. The man understood that the soldiers were also in the kill zone and therefore would definitely not shoot. After activating his system, Sakuya guessed that a level 63 assassin would be difficult to stop quickly. But if we took Tsuchida hostage, then there was every chance of breaking through. The man drew his sword sharply and prepared to attack. The Tiger Roar Guild members and the soldiers stood ready to repel the attack. Tsuchida, having activated the shield, immediately began to defend himself, shouting that he was not the weak link. Sakuya realized that the agent's defensive abilities were not like those of other classes, as he could analyze more incoming attacks. And at that distance, the man was able to block it. The shield could also only resist swords, but the level of this resistance was much higher. Tsuchida's shield should have been able to withstand a full-scale attack from a level 69 warrior. But even that seemed like a trifle to the man. And just as Sakuya struck, the shield quickly reflected the attack, causing Mukujima to jump back. Thinking that victory was on his side, Tsuchida began shouting, telling Sakuya to surrender. And when Sora's father failed to land the blow, Osamu asked if he was now willing to go himself, or if he should be thrown into prison with his comrades. The man began to think that this was the end and there was no other way out but to agree to go to prison. His supporters started shouting, advising the boss not to do this. Sakuya didn't know what to do at all, since he couldn't supply his comrades either. And having made his decision, he put away his sword, realizing that there was no other way out. To everyone's surprise, the man held out his sword without hesitation, showing that he was ready to surrender voluntarily. Jiro started shouting, trying to persuade his boss not to do this, although he himself understood that he didn't have much of a choice. Osamu, smiling from ear to ear, happily declared that the man had acted wisely. The people of the Unification Guild began to justify the boss, saying that the blow was for show, but Jiro quickly calmed everyone down, saying that the boss was trying to protect them. In fact, Jiro received a signal from the boss that when he raises his sword, it means he needs to prepare, and when he lowers it, he needs to attack. The Tiger Roar Guild and the soldiers, of course, were unaware of these signs, which was a great advantage for Jiro and the others. And suddenly Sakuya let go of the sword, after which it simply evaporated and disappeared in mid-flight. Tsuchida began to scream, not understanding what was happening, clutching his shield tighter. Before he could even comprehend anything, he saw Sora's father suddenly running towards him. The man thought that this shield had a spell that blocked sword attacks, and he thought that hand-to-hand combat was certainly not scary for him. But he was very wrong in his thoughts, seeing how, right in flight, his sword appeared in Sakuya's hands again. Tsuchida didn't even consider this scary, thinking how a person with a level 69 couldn't cut through his shield. And what was there to say about Sakuya? But Sakuya himself had his own plan, and right in flight, Jiro began to help him by activating his power. And with the help of his special power, Jiro sent large chunks of rocks at the two. As Sakuya prepared to strike, those boulders came closer and closer to Tsuchida and his shield. And in an instant, the stones broke the man's shield into small pieces, throwing him back. The man finally realized that it was not a shield at all, but a hammer, which was formed by those very stones combined with the sword. Before he could understand anything, the man quickly saw Sakuya's hand in front of him, who was simply beside himself with rage. At this time, Osamu began to laugh, shouting that he knew what the enemy's target was. Immediately understanding everything, the man rushed towards the boss of the Unification Guild, pointing his dagger at him. Jiro, who was controlling the process and providing protection to the boss, reacted quickly. And in a matter of seconds, a stone grate appeared in front of Osamu's face, interrupting his plans to kill the man. The leader of the soldiers did not expect such a maneuver, and he had no choice but to stop. Tsuchida, moving further and further away, shouted to the soldiers who were already on full alert that Sakuya had gone mad, ordering them to open fire. The soldiers quickly began firing from all sides with their rifles, thinking that they would catch the guild off guard. But then Jiro intervened again, controlling the stones to form a complete defense for his boss. The firing site was suddenly blocked by a large rock, leaving all the firing soldiers behind it, and Sakuya could attack Tsuchida again. Sora's father was satisfied with this outcome, thinking that if they could just stop him, they would be able to retreat. In a matter of seconds, the man's hand was already near his frightened opponent, and at the last moment, Tsuchida suddenly jumped out of the man's grip. Thinking that the enemy had run back, the man turned around in search of Tsuchida, but suddenly, he saw Osamu standing nearby instead of him, who declared that the stone fate created by his assistant had plunged him into the shadows and thus given him an advantage. And so the man was able to mark the remnants of light magic on Tsuchida's shield, thus fulfilling the conditions for activating the killer ability and shadow trance. The man also added that without a hostage, Sakuya would definitely lose. And wanting to end this, Osamu began to activate his power to its fullest. Sora's father was horrified to realize that he had been deceived again. Jiro was unable to help the boss this time and could only watch what was happening in horror. Even the soldiers themselves were surprised by the capabilities of their commander and froze. Osamu, who was about to strike, stopped in an instant when he saw that everyone around him began to look at him strangely. And suddenly he felt a strange hand on his shoulder and Sora's voice, asking what surprised him so much. Osamu began to wonder who it was, assuming that it could be Mukajima's help. But the question remained how he managed to get to them at all. But the man knew one thing for sure. This man was his enemy, and whoever struck first would win. Deciding to take advantage of the opportunity, the man reached for the flask hanging on his belt. Tsuchida, seeing the deadly poison that Tiger Roar had prepared to kill the level 90 monster, couldn't believe that the commander had managed to steal it from them. Screaming for the boy to let him go, Osamu grabbed the bottle of poison tighter. And at the last moment, he smashed it with his dagger, pouring the contents onto everyone around, hoping that the poison would fall on the guy. Sakuya screamed Sora's name in horror, fearing for his son's life. Tsuchida, who was standing nearby, immediately smelled the poison and began to choke from the smoke around him. The soldiers, seeing the fog at first, didn't even understand what it was. But after several soldiers fell to the ground and began to choke, the rest ran away from the fog. Tsuchida, of course, didn't like all of this, but the man could at least calm down that they had killed Mukajima's ally. But suddenly, through the fog, he saw a hand reaching towards his face, and before he could see anything, the man and the commander suddenly flew back as if someone had pushed them hard. Tsuchida, right in flight, could only be horrified at how this guy could move, because this poison is capable of taking down a level 90 monster.